old-fashioned and simple death from wayward phaser fire would be a dream come true next to the array of bizarre and messed up mishaps that are sadly part of the job description for Star Trek's red shirts and miscellaneous crewmen. And women. Sure, come the next show, Kirk and co may act as though everything's back to normal, but it's hard for us to forget the sorry saps that follow. So with that in mind then, I'm Ellie with TrekCulture with a little bit of a cold, so do forgive any nasal sounds, here with the 10 most messed up deaths in Star Trek the original series. Number 10, a pinch of salt in the man trap. Now what better way to start off than a gnarly fate seen in The Man Trap, the very first episode to be aired in Star Trek's original run. Clearly, freakish fatalities were to become a mainstay in the show, and they had no issues raising the curtain with among one of the most grotesque. The original series begins with the Enterprise visiting the planet M113 to deliver supplies, conduct routine medical exams, the usual. What's also established as usual, however, is the doomed fate of whichever poor schmuck happens to accompany any combination of Kirk, Dr. McCoy and Spock on a new planet. In this case, it's crewman Darnell, who falls for what he believes to be a beautiful woman, but is in fact a shape-shifting, salt-sucking monster. Just standard Star Trek then. After Darnell is disposed of, the chameleonic killer proceeds to stalk the corridors of the Enterprise, relieving the unlucky crewmen it encounters of both their salt and their lives. Now it does turn out that it's less of a rampage and more just a simple fact of the creature's survival, but that's little comfort to those salt-devoid corpses who were just unlucky enough to come across a pretty woman on the ship. Number 9, speared in the Galileo 7. Now I know what you're thinking, but no, that is not some weird reference to some sort of wind-knocking wrestling move. It's actually pretty literal. A wandering red shirt, or well, technically actually it's more yellow, gets impaled by an almost comically oversized spear and falls to his death with it still sticking out of his back. When the shuttlecraft Galileo is pulled off course, the crew is marooned on Taurus 2, a desolate and dreary planet. Clearly a perfect choice for an emergency landing. Immediately, Lieutenants Latimer and Gaetano are sent on that cruel death sentence of a duty, scouting the area. Sure enough, they quickly encounter the planet's monstrously aggressive and primitive inhabitants, who greet their new visitors by way of throwing a very large and unwieldy spear at the first intruder they see. Thus, poor Latimer meets his end via the pointy end of an obscenely large stick. And if that wasn't enough, the weapon remains lodged in his corpse, sticking absurdly high in the air as he lays lifeless on the ground. Now that does make you think that Kirk probably leaves out most of the details when he breaks the news to the families of these hapless red shirts. Number 8, for the love of a trike in Miri. After the gang encounters an apparent duplicate of Earth, their curiosity is piqued enough that they decide to beam down and explore. Once there, they're almost immediately attacked by a disfigured and quite deranged resident whose main dispute with them seems to be that they've approached his broken tricycle. Kirk promptly delivers a beatdown on the disturbed fellow, who nonetheless remains more concerned with the trike. At this point, Kirk notes that he seems to have the mind of a child and is doubtless feeling a little guilty for having punched him in the face repeatedly. The sight of a full-grown man breaking down in heartbreak over a trike is unsettling to say the least, but it gets even worse as he then suffers a fatal seizure while gibbering hysterically. Now it's not really much of a welcome for the Enterprise crew, and to be honest, their fortunes don't really improve as they spend the rest of the episode trying to avoid the same grisly fate. Later on, Kirk is held hostage by a group of kids who administer on him the dreaded bonk, bonk, bonk on the head. Thankfully, he's not killed, otherwise we'd have another entry on this list. Number 7, blood drained by a cloud in Obsession. The regrettably red-clad crewmen of the Enterprise rarely live long enough to rue their choice of colours. Anytime they're beamed down to a strange planet's surface, even to do the most routine of surveys, it's clear that there will be blood. Or in the case of Obsession, there won't be. The terribly unlucky redshirts scouting Argus 10 are hardly pleased to make the acquaintance of a seemingly intelligent gaseous cloud. In fact, they end up looking like they've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, they might say. It's a monstrous vampiric entity that drains every red corpuscle from the blood of its victims. At least they might if they weren't bone-cold pale corpses. The being is sadly well known to Captain Kirk, and the episode details his obsessive quest for vengeance against the blood-sucking Billow. Deep space offers the wonderful, the weird, and the worrying, and the chilling sight of those snow-white red shirts is definitely the latter. Having their blood drained by a hungry haze probably wasn't what they signed up for, but on Star Trek, someone's gotta do it. Number 6. Unnatural causes in the deadly years. Here's one, shockingly, not suffered by one of the calamitous red shirts. Indeed, perhaps Kirk was feeling some sympathy for his ever-ending security teams when he chose to give them a break in the deadly years, instead personally beaming down to a research station on Gamma Hydra 4 along with his key personnel. Well, plus Chekhov. And it's Chekhov who goes on to make the rather horrible discovery of a desiccated, wrinkled corpse that somewhat resembles the grandpa from the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Setting aside the macabre nature of a dead body just laying around in a darkened room, we soon learn that the cause of death wasn't nearly as natural as it seems. In fact, it's low-level radiation from a comet that's causing rapid aging, which has now affected almost the entire landing party, plus the surviving station crew. The nasty effects of growing old become evident as various victims of the radiation are shown to succumb to weakness and senility in a very short time before passing. As Kirk puts it, what a way to die. Number 5. Burned to a crisp in Devil in the Dark. It's a well-known Trek trope that caves are always bad news. Whether it's collapsing walls, or antagonistic androids, or bizarre space creatures lurking within, the appearance of caves in Star Trek generally indicates that someone, somewhere, is about to meet their maker, especially if they're wearing a red shirt. In The Devil in the Dark, Kirk and co face off against a subterranean slayer known as the Horta, who's not so silently picking off miners and engineers on Janus 6. For investigative purposes, they don't have a lot to go on when examining what's left of the victims, who are reduced to simmering chunks of charcoal. We're fortunate, however, to witness a typically ill-fated redshirt wandering the caves on his lonesome, which is always a bad idea, before being ambushed by the blazing blob that is the Horta and getting summarily burned to a crisp. And if that wasn't enough, the later revelation that the Horta is simply protecting its eggs renders it wholly sympathetic, and the barbecued remains of the redshirt are never avenged. I mean, if you want to look for a bright side, thanks to the Horta, you don't need to worry about cremation. Number 4. Beam me back, Scotty, in And the Children Shall Lead. Most redshirts probably prepare themselves for potential calamities the moment they're informed that they're being called up for one of those dreaded away missions. But even the most pessimistic of crewmen probably expect to survive at least a little bit longer than those poor saps in And the Children Shall Lead managed to. Believing the Enterprise to be orbiting the planet Triacus, Kirk orders a routine transport of his away team to the surface, each of them prepared for the worst. Unfortunately, the worst arrives far sooner than anyone expected. It turns out that the planet's apparent presence is merely a visual illusion, meaning that Kirk has unwittingly beamed his loyal men into outer space. Now, it is largely left up to the imagination, but just the thought of being transported instantly from the safety of the ship into the cold vacuum of space is chilling. Who needs fancy execution machines when you can just use the transporter? Still, while it is a horrific way to go, at least they, unlike viewers, were spared the pain of having to watch this infamously awful episode unfold. Number 3. Into Hell's Mouth in the Doomsday Machine. Now, while the mission of the Enterprise is to seek out new life, there are instances where they probably had rather not. Take the horrific planet-killing device in the Doomsday Machine, which plays the proverbial Moby Dick to guest starring Commodore Decker's Captain Ahab. Once rescued by the Enterprise crew, the maniacal Decker spends the duration of the episode obsessively trying to conquer the relentless and seemingly indestructible titular automaton. Eventually, the tragic Commodore seems to realize that enough is enough, opting for a suicide run by way of steering a shuttlecraft directly into the machine's flaming maw. It would be quite understandable if Decker slightly regrets his decision as the gaping inferno grows ever closer, and the sheer terror on his face wholly conveys his looming oblivion. The very image of the tiny craft flying into the mouth of hell is staggeringly bleak. Now, not to add insult to injury, but it does turn out that this noble sacrifice does next to no damage to the Juggernaut-like machine whatsoever. So if there were any remains of Decker left to bury, his tombstone would probably say something along the lines of, "At least he tried." Number 2. Psychedelic mind attack in the lights of Zetar. Even the most routine of missions never seem to go quite to plan in Star Trek. Not even a trip to the library. Arriving at Memory Alpha, the galaxy's central information outpost, Kirk and the landing party would expect the place to be relatively quiet, but the dead silence they're met with is eerily ominous. In one of Star Trek's most terrifying moments, the crew finds a darkened room full of corpses and a Zetarian scientist on death's door. On approach, she emits a series of garbled, guttural sounds that would put the Grudge's famous ghost to shame. If that wasn't enough, her face contorts unnaturally in all of horror, agony, and panic, all the while shifting in weird colours to provide pure nightmare fuel. Only after all this does she finally expire, and McCoy helpfully lists all her ailments. Severe brain hemorrhaging due to distortion of all neural systems, dissolution of autonomic nervous system, and so on. Put like that, it definitely doesn't sound like much fun, and despite the pretty colours, it doesn't really look it either. To boldly go where no man has gone before. I think sometimes it's enough to make man want to turn around and go back to where he came from, and fast. Number 1. Cubic Crush in By Any Other Name. Evidently then, the unlucky red shirts and miscellaneous crewmen of the Enterprise have met their fate in a wide variety of ranges, from violent to disturbing to just plain weird. Some lucky officers, however, have experienced deaths that encompass all of these qualities. So it was for poor Yeoman Thompson in By Any Other Name, an ill-fated victim of the oddly specific powers demonstrated by the Kelvans and their nifty control belts. Punishing Kirk for his attempt to escape the clutches of the dastardly Kelvans, they used their belts to transform 2 of his landing party, including Thompson, into small chalky cubes. Perhaps sensing that Kirk was rather desensitized by then to his male crewmen being offed, the Kelvans opted to hit him where it really hurt, by choosing the unfortunately feminine Thompson for execution, namely by crushing her cubic stand-in into dust. Continuing on from the Kirk era's most messed up demises, the Next Generation found new and equally creative, equally unhinged ways to dispatch its characters. If you did want to avoid the worst of fates, it was probably best to stay away from the Enterprise D entirely. If not, then at least watch where you're walking. Of course, one of the most infamous of awful exits in TNG, which won't be featuring on this list because, well, quite frankly, we've already covered it to death on this channel, was that of Tasha Yar. Personally, I feel sorry for all those poor officers who had to process the 24th century death certificates. The cause of death was what now? If you say so, Dr. Crusher. Well, with that in mind, I'm Ellie for TrekCulture, here with the 10 most messed up deaths in Star Trek The Next Generation. Number 10. Called Me Mother, Commander Remick and Parasite. If you can stomach the body horror of it all, the final fate of Lieutenant Commander Dexter Remick in Conspiracy was without a doubt one of the worst in Star Trek. Although his fictional serial killer first namesake would have just probably called that breakfast. Just how long Remick had been walking around with Mother Buttbug inside him was never made clear. But given the size of the thing, it's no wonder he needed a good sit down near the end there. "You don't understand," Mother Remick says to Picard and Riker. No, not completely, and I prefer we keep it that way. Everyone ends up learning a lot more than they bargained for about Remick's innards and butt-bug biology when Riker and Picard aim both their phasers and fire. Their combined power causes the Lieutenant Commander's head to explode, followed unceremoniously by melting Chesterfett exposing Mother, who emerges snarling like she's been disturbed mid-xenomorph reunion. Picard then gives a look of most mild disgust, as though someone had just scuffed the bridge carpet rather than just eviscerated a fellow Starfleet officer. And of course, the crew of the Horatio was still very dead. Number 9. Death to the Dekion field, crew of the Enterprise D. Round and round they go. Where the temporal causality loop stops, nobody knows, until Data figures out why 3 is the magic number. The cold opener to Cause and Effect is one of the most dramatic put to screen. What a way to announce a reboot with a whole new cast! Of course not. This was just one of those weirdly beautiful Star Trek technicalities in the Typhon expanse. They were all back to playing poker soon enough, worry not. Death, deal, repeat. Death, deal, repeat. If having your molecules ripped apart by a warp core breach several times over weren't bad enough, the most messed up thing was that even though each loop was a reset, the crew became more and more aware that they'd done it all before. This wasn't déjà vu, this was déjà vécu, which literally means already lived, and lived, and lived. More than that, when Dr. Crusher realized she was not just hearing voices, but actually hearing voices, Geordi and Data figured out that they were in fact listening to themselves. The crew on a path to disaster, echoes of the Decion field. Now they had the MP3 of their own doom! Number 8, Nightmare on Helm Street. Crew of the Britain. What went down on the Britain was a waking nightmare. Not heard from after sending out a distress call 29 days prior, by the time the Enterprise D showed up, all of the crew were dead, having murdered each other in several manners, one more brutal than the last. The rescue in Rescue Party is moot in this instance, as the team from the D beamed over. The captain of the Britain had been stabbed through the chest by a rather hefty-looking dagger. One crew member had had half of their flesh melted away by a phaser on a setting of 6 or 7, and 2 other bridge officers were cause unknown, save for a horrible head wound and a dab of dried blood. Aboard the Britain, the night terrors were made manifest. 34 dead by their own often bare hands. It turned out that the Britain had become trapped adrift in a Tychon's Rift, an energy-absorbing rupture in space. And now the Enterprise D was stuck there too, oh yay! Whilst rare and tough to escape from though, Tychon's rifts don't usually cause people to kill. There were telepathic aliens in this one too, however, and their mental distress call was preventing REM's sleep in everyone but the Betazoids. If you've ever felt a little homicidal without that coffee in the morning, that's but a fraction of how messed up it was for the crew of the Britain. Number 7, Miller, Yuri, Q, Who, All Life on Earth. When doctoral candidate Stanley Miller and supervisor Harold Urey were running their famous experiment that set out to reproduce the atmospheric conditions thought to have existed on Earth between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago, the primordial soup, in order to demonstrate that organic molecules could indeed be produced from inorganic compounds in such an environment, they weren't counting on an anti-time eruption as a factor for the chemistry. When Q transported Picard back to his extremely old stomping grounds in All Good Things, however, whilst there were already amino acids present on that prebiotic Earth, they had been stopped short of forming the first protein by the anomaly. There's the everyone dies and then comes back to life messed up, and then there's the all good things every animal, plant, fungus, protist, bacterium and virus will never have existed on Earth in the first place kind of messed up. It is estimated that as of 2022, the number of humans to ever have lived was in the order of 117 billion, and who knows how many more by the 24th century and beyond. Plus, in the far, far, far distant past, the anti-time anomaly, which Picard had technically created with the convergence of 3 inverse tachyon pulses, filled the entire Alpha Quadrant. That's a whole lot of extra effed up non-existence before Jean-Luc was able to figure it all out. Number 6, Rocky Rebellion, crew of the Pegasus. No good deed or mutiny with the best of motivations goes unpunished. Captain at the time, Eric Pressman's plan to outmatch the Romulans by ignoring the Treaty of Algernon was less than solid, and as a result, a good number of the crew of the Pegasus who stood up to him ended their lives as a rock. Unfortunately, in this case, they weren't just going through a phase. In 2358, when a test of the experimental and illegal, I might add, phasing cloak went horribly wrong aboard the USS Pegasus, only 8 of the crew, including Ensign Riker, who didn't join the rebellion, made it off the ship with Pressman alive. From the vantage point of a coward's escape pod, it then looked as though the Pegasus was destroyed in a warp core explosion. In fact, what they'd seen was plasma from overloading relays igniting in space. The damaged USS Pegasus then drifted into a phased state, only for the cloak to fall at the worst possible moment, killing everyone who had remained on board. The rest was covered up and classified until Riker faced his very own kind of rock and a hard place. Number 5. Death is better than small talk, baryon sweep bye-byes. Had Captain Janeway been there, she would no doubt have designated Commander Calvin Hutchinson a bit of a windbag. Of course, the smallness of his talk doesn't mean he deserved to be shot dead without so much as a saddle to defend himself, but you know, eventually there is only so much one can say about the weather and the mating habits of the Akarian hornfowl before disruptors are drawn. And no, I will not call you Hutch. At least back on the Enterprise D, in Starship Mine, there was no time for idle chit-chat. Get to the point or get hit by the baryon sweep. That was indeed the fate of most of the trilithium resin thieves after Captain Picard disabled their field diverter. In fact, Picard had already nerve-pinched and sedated one of the meddling mercenaries, Devore. Oh, hello there, Tim Russ. And presumably he was still sleeping when the sweep got to him. And he also wasted no time setting a Jeffries tube trap for Sattler. All we heard was a scream as the latter was being hit face first by a deadly wave of green. Picard then proceeded to crossbow another and turn 10 forward into a gunpowder gauntlet. Head mercenary Kyros managed to escape, but not before Picard had ensured that she would meet a highly explosive end. That's really a rather lot of killing for a Starfleet captain. Although, arguably, he wasn't left with too much of a choice. Plus, at least it finally gave the crew of the Enterprise D something to talk about. Number 4. T-cell hack breaks the ensign's back. Ensign Dern. When the captain's away, the progressively de-evolving crew will play. And kill. Don't forget the kill. All it took was a teeny tiny synthetic T-cell sent to fight off Lieutenant Barclay's Uridelan flu for all aboard the Enterprise D to turn to mayhem and murder in Genesis. With an arachnid, proto-hominid, and whatever Worf was amongst others roaming about, it's a wonder there weren't bodies lining the corridors. As it happened, there was only one confirmed death. Ensign Dern. Since everyone was going back to the wild ways, Dern's death was particularly savage. It's never stated who killed the con officer, but Proto-Riker was only in the other room. Just saying. It would have to have been someone with the ancestral strength to break an upper spinal column. In 3 places, as per Data's in situ autopsy report. Just spitballing here, but that also does make pure concentrate of Klingon Worf a suspect too. Not only did Dr. Crusher's hack lead to a broken back, poor Ensign Dern, technically no name unless you watched the end credits or read the script, also suffered severe lacerations to his chest and neck. By the I didn't sign up for this look on his face, eyes wide open in horror up to the ceiling, and the amount of blood, those wounds were made before death. His console also didn't do too well out of it either. Number 3. I shot a spooky doppelganger of a man, one Picard, another Enterprise D. In some mythologies, the appearance of your ghostly double is considered to be a harbinger of death. I suppose in this case, death depends on who was the omen for whom. Things were already messed up from the very beginning of Time Squared. Dr. Pulaski was clearly expecting an omelette, but Riker made rotten scrambled eggs instead. It was out in the middle of nowhere, for Starfleet and the Federation at least, that the Enterprise D bumped into the ashen-faced facsimile of Captain Picard from 6 hours in the future. Suffering from some major 24th century jet lag, dazed and confused whilst his body clock realigned, the other Picard spent his final hours alive in a semi-unconscious, nightmarish state, being shouted at by himself aboard the ship, his ship he'd seen destroyed not long before. In order to end the cycle, the non-temporarily displaced Picard barely hesitates in grabbing a phaser from the handily located and hardly secured shuttle bay locker. Picard shoots his other self dead without batting an eyelid, and then goes back to the bridge to leave Dr. Pulaski with the mess. And more effed up still than all of that, O'Brien then has to bear witness to his dead captain. Why? Isn't he going to suffer enough? Number 2, the polymerization experiment, Lieutenant Hagler. There are yet more spooky goings-on for the crew of the Enterprise D in schisms. Riker's having trouble sleeping, and it's not because of his cooking. Geordi's losing connection, Mott's losing his grip on the scissors, and Data's losing his chronometer. I think a little poetry is apt for this one. A polymer's doom. Then we went to a room for some time and observed why a handful of crew from the ship were perturbed by the clicks and the ominous light overhead. We did miss the lieutenant not tucked up in bed. Okay, that's not quite the poetic heights of Data, if heavily inspired by his verses, but hopefully you get the point. Lieutenant Edward Hagler probably just wanted some peace and quiet in his fancy pajamas, but instead he was kidnapped and experimented upon by a gang of life forms from subspace. The last we saw of Hagler, he was heavy heaving through his blue-grey, deoxygenated face. We only know he died because Riker remembered to mention that fact near the episode's end. Not much of a eulogy, certainly not very poetic, but definitely messed up. Number 1, flaw in the floor, Lieutenant Van Meter. In theory should be just remembered for its dictionary definition of a double entendre on the part of Data. However, whilst the rub of the plot is the deadpan android's algorithmic try at a relationship, the rest of the intrigue centres on the exploration of a dark matter nebula and the mysterious occurrences aboard the Enterprise that result. Aside from Picard having to tidy up his ready room and from Spot suddenly getting a cat flap, there was little overly alarming about the odd incidents at first. That is until Lieutenant Van Meter suffered one of the worst fates imaginable. In joining Commander LaForge and Ensign Thorne to go check out potential structural damage between decks 36 and 37, Van Meter found out exactly what was between decks 36 and 37. Organ and bone-crushing death is what was there. Don't worry though, Data has now confirmed his hypothesis at least, so whew, that's okay then. The high amounts of dark matter in the nebula were causing gaps in the fabric of normal space, meaning that the floor had basically just opened up and then closed back around Van Meter. All we heard were her agonising screams before Geordi and Thorne rounded the corner to find only half of the very dead lieutenant popping up out of the carpet. Yikes.
Hi, I'm Duncan Rillick, no relation, and I collect relics from before the burn. Thanks to a temporal wormhole, I now have an unlimited supply of TrekCulture t-shirts, and I'm selling them to you! You could be wearing this stylish down and up t-shirt. Or, how about this fish watching design? Bright yellow on black, the colours I'd use in thumbnails, I tell you that for nothing. I plan to take these designs and transfer them via quantum duplication onto hats, mugs, and posters. So look out for those. Ah! Treat this unlimited supply as a limited time deal. Get your t-shirt quick. Who's your daddy?
Star Trek Deep Space Nine does have a bit of a reputation for being, at that point anyway, the darkest of the Star Trek series. And I'm not gonna lie to you, there's a bit of truth to that. There are some things that happen on that show which might possibly break normal folks. You only need to look at what O'Brien went through. There's also like the cruelty of some of the things that happened. You had people who were inches away from survival who didn't make it, and others who made impassioned confessions only to be brutally murdered for their honesty. I'm not gonna lie to you folks, this is not the feel-good list that you might be looking for today, and because we're going to be discussing deaths, obviously full spoiler alert is in effect here. You may want to go and play with a puppy or something after this one. Although knowing the nature of this list, that puppy's probably going to try and eat you. With that, I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are the 10 most messed up deaths in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Number 10, Vargas, the Siege of AR-558. Vargas was one of those unlucky few who were stationed on AR-558 midway through the Dominion War. Now, this was a location in the Chintaka system wherein the Dominion had a supremely important communications relay. They fended off repeated attacks from Jem'Hadar columns and also had to put up with the Houdinis, little bombs that hid in subspace and could go off at any time. The arrival of Captain Sisko and several others of the crew of the Defiant did very little to raise Vargas's spirits, to be honest. He had to put up with so much, and that trauma was as evident as the bandage on his arm. Then, in the final days of what could have been his posting, a brutal attack from yet another Jem'Hadar force saw the man stabbed in the back. This was one of the cruelest deaths that happened in Deep Space Nine. I mean, he was mere hours away from freedom, only to be killed. It may have been horrible, but it was one of the strongest depictions of the horrors of war that Star Trek had done to that point. Number 9. Kai Wynn, What You Leave Behind. How best to remember Kai Wynn? I mean, Louise Fletcher did an incredible job playing the so, like, you love to hate them type role here. She was engaging and she was so utterly convicted of being right all the time, saying that you absolutely had sympathy for Sisko running a mile whenever she arrived on the station. Her descent into evil in the latter days of the Dominion War was not exactly shocking. I mean, she had spent so long in her just single-minded pursuit of power. The only thing that mattered to her was rising to the top, and the manner by which she did that was not that important. Her death, as quick as it was, happened as she tried once again to try and save face. Bitter at the realization that her beloved pirates would choose Dukat to be their emissary and not her, she warned Sisko that the key to defeating them was to destroy the text of the Costamojin. Dukat, with a casually cruel "Are you still here?" flicked his hand and had the fires of the Fire Caves consume the woman. A thoroughly unpleasant end for a, frankly, unpleasant person. Number 8. Kai Opaka, Battle Lines. This entry, I suppose, is messed up, but also is quite fitting for where the character saw herself going. Kai Opaka kept the Bajoran people together for much of the occupation, using their faith to unify them against adversity. Now, while she managed to save many lives, she was not without her failings. She gave the location of a group of Bajoran fighters to the Cardassians, which did lead to her son being saved, but it led to the deaths of many others. So her fate in battle lines could be seen as her penance. Traveling through to the Gamma Quadrant, she's killed in the crash that destroys the Yangtze Kiang. Then she sits back up again. Happy days. Well, not really. There's a catch. This revivification only happens and stays in effect on the planet's surface. Now, she's not alone. There are 2 warring factions who continually come together, kill each other, wake up again, and repeat the process the next day. Opaka elects to remain alive and remain behind on this planet and dedicate the rest of her life, however long it may be, to helping these 2 warring factions find peace. It definitely qualifies as a messed up death because, frankly, her afterlife will become a constant life of servitude. Although we suspect that if we were in Opaka's place, we may not see it as messed up, but simply deserving. Number 7. Jadzia Dax, Tears the Prophets. You knew it was coming. Killed by a disgruntled producer or a possessed supervillain, we'll leave that one up to you. Jadzia Dax was in the Bajoran Temple aboard Deep Space Nine when Dukat beamed in. His mission was to attack the Prophets. His collateral damage was Jadzia Dax. This may be a very cynical way of looking at it, but the signs were all there. You know, she'd just been told by Dr. Bashir that, yep, that medicine he was giving her to allow herself and Worf to have a baby was working, things were going well, they just bought a boat called the Live Forever. Her number was up. Mid-prayer of thanks to the Prophets, Dukat beams in, raises his arm, and sends a blast of energy at her that kills her. She does survive long enough for Bashir to save the Dax symbiont, but there's nothing he can do for Jadzia, and she dies on her sickbed with Worf and Sisko beside her. There's a small consolation knowing that the Dax symbiont survived to be transferred into Ezri Dax, but quite frankly, that is very little comfort for this stupid, unfair death. Number 6. Chulak's victims, Field of Fire. Lieutenant Hector Ilario, Science Officer Greta Van de Weg, and Petty Officer Zim Brott all ended up on the wrong end of Chulak's modified TR-116 rifle. This one had a micro-transporter attached to the firing chamber, which meant Chulak could stand anywhere on the station and shoot anyone he wanted, and it wouldn't be traced back to him. These were the victims of a man who was so enraged by the joy of others, owing to the amount of personal loss that he had felt. These people had nothing in common, save for the fact that they had photos in their quarters of happy, smiling times, something Chulak felt was directly mocking him. For this completely unfair mocking feeling, all of these people lost their lives. It took Ezri Dax channeling the memories and spirit of her former host Duran Dax, something he knew a thing or two about serial killers, to track down Chulak. In a nail-biting finale, Ezri just manages to miss a bullet from Chulak while shooting him in the shoulder. Number 5. Crewman Muniz, the ship. Crewman Muniz became an early casualty in the slow build-up to the Dominion War. Deep Space Nine rarely shied away from showing the horrors of war, but they really went the extra mile in the Season 5 episode, The Ship, depicting a slow, painful death for this unlucky man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Muniz was part of the away mission that was assigned with salvaging the downed Jem'Hadar ship, and thus came under fire by Jem'Hadar, being hit by one of their weapons, condemning the man to a slow death, something that Worf found particularly grating. He butted heads with O'Brien, saying that they should kill the man and put him out of his misery, whereas O'Brien vehemently objected, thinking that there was always hope, and would that the episode have taken O'Brien's view rather than later in part confirming Worf's view. Muniz slowly bleeds to death, and in fact passes away mere hours before the rescue party arrives. Number 4. Mila, What You Leave Behind. Mila was guilty of nothing more than association, but this did not spare her from an ignoble end in the series finale What You Leave Behind. She'd been housekeeper to Anabra Tain for many years and most likely was Garrick's mother, though this was never confirmed on screen. When Garrick, Damar and Colonel Kira found themselves stranded on Cardassia Prime, she took them in, allowing them to stay in her cellar. Now, she did make them clean it, to be fair. Her support of them, and by extension the resistance movement, came to a shattering end when she was discovered by the Jem'Hadar and the Cardassians, thrown down the stairs of her cellar, and then, if she hadn't been killed before, murdered when a bomb went off right beside her head. Garrick was devastated by this death, and this was part of the reason he took such pleasure in killing Weyoun in cold blood when they eventually made it to Dominion HQ. Number 3. Tora Ziyal, Sacrifice of Angels. Meeting her father was the beginning of the end for Tora Ziyal back in the Season 4 episode Indiscretion. I mean, again, the warning was there. He held her at gunpoint the moment he saw her. It's very odd to say this, but possible she was better off with the Breen? Now, for a time, things did look to be on the up for her. Dukat, instead of killing her, took her in, went to bat for her, and lost all of his standing in society because of it. You see, in Cardassian society, orphans have no position, so Dukat standing up for her lost him, his family, and his commission. They then traveled together aboard the freighter Grumal, which would then lead to her becoming part of his one-man war against the Klingon Empire. Kira was able to finally convince Dukat that this was no place for Ziyal, and she took up residence on Deep Space Nine, which is where she stayed until the closing moments of the Dominion occupation of DS9, when she confessed to her father that she'd been a part of the plan to free Rom and Jake, Kira and Lita from prison. Dukat looks as if, for a moment, he might be able to overlook this, but he never gets the chance, because from behind him, Damar pulls out his disruptor and fires straight at Ziyal's chest. She survives mere moments later, dying in her father's arms. Number 2. Eamon Maritza duet. Eamon Maritza is a name that will probably never turn up in the annals of greatest Cardassians of all time. We believe he really has a place there because of the personal sacrifice he endured to bring the Cardassian people to see what they had done over the occupation. His efforts, however noble, were perhaps misguided. His last days were spent attempting to take on the appearance and identity of Gul Darheel, the so-called Butcher of Galatep. He would allow himself to be caught, tried, and then executed as a war criminal, forcing the Cardassians to admit their guilt. He was discovered as Maritza, which crushed him, but as Kira said, his death would prove nothing other than another innocent life being condemned to die. He felt bitter that his attempt was thwarted as he walked through the promenade with Kira. Perhaps they might be able to come up with another way of helping the Cardassians grow, if it wasn't for that one Bajoran man who took that opportunity to pull out a knife and stab Maritza in the back, killing him for no other reason than he was Cardassian, which for that man was enough. But as Kira said, no, it wasn't. Number 1, Vedic Bareil, life support. Bareil died slowly, piece by piece, being carved away as he was forcibly kept alive long enough to finish peace talks. Now, he may have volunteered for this, but he died slowly and painfully. Watching him was slow and painful, as Kira certainly felt, but it was also slow and painful for Bashir, who was the one forced to do the carving. The episode Life Support sees the death of this once great contender for Kai. It sees some humanity, so to speak, from Kai Wynn as she attempts to conduct these peace talks, but very much relies on Bareil, credits him until after he dies, wherein she takes all of the credit for herself. By the time the end actually comes, it's hard to say how much of Bareil slipped away at that point, because how much of Bareil was actually left. It was a slow, sad ending, one that Kira would never truly recover from.
I've got news for you, crewmen. Voyager isn't exactly a safe haven, Captain Janeway pointed out in Good Shepherd. Truer words were never spoken, and with all the death and destruction above, Mortimer Harron did just as well to stay down on Deck 15, let's be honest. He might have been missing out, but at least he wasn't missing any more base pairs on his 13th chromosome or otherwise. For the crew of the Intrepid class, and that after the initial demise of a good deal of the original senior staff, a previously largely unexplored quadrant brought with it previously unknown hazards, as well as a fresh batch of homicidal aliens. At first, if the Kazon were just a pain in the secondary command processors, the Vidians were far more deadly, though the phage was just a phase for Voyager, soon past the boundaries of the local organ harvest. The Borg's backyard, the Herodians' hunting grounds, and the Malon's mess were then but a handful of the extra obstacles the ship had to pass through en route back to the Alpha Quadrant. And let's not forget the mortal danger posed by numerous anomalies, wacky nebulae, and whatever the Q count as. More than one crew member ended their journey home through one of Voyager's torpedo tubes, and a fair few weren't even granted that final dignity. In this quadrant, our delta means death. I'm Ellie for TrekCulture, and these are the 10 most messed up deaths in Star Trek Voyager. Number 10, don't love what you've done with the face, Lieutenant Durst. Just a quick note for all the Vidians out there. If you do want to impress a Klingon, maybe just bring some blood wine, rather than a skin transplant from the guy you've just murdered, for Pete's sake. Even Michael Myers had the decency to wear a Captain Kirk mask, not William Shatner's actual face. Having only appeared briefly in one episode prior to the Grim Graft, Lieutenant Durst's time on Voyager was both short and stomach-churning. Gruesome fun fact also about faces: the actor who played Durst, Brian Markinson, also played his Vidian butcher, so at least no one had to be killed for their flesh in real life. Joking aside though, that knowledge does add an extra layer of horror to Markinson's portrayal of the Vidian chief surgeon. Having to pretend that your own face is now a mask that one of your characters has torn off to wear from another one of your characters is probably not something they teach you at drama school. Well, maybe they do at RADA, I don't know. We also know from the very first appearance of the species in Phage, and then later in Deadlock, But the Vidians don't seem to really care if you're dead or even unconscious before they start their organ extraction process. I'll leave you guys to consider the grisly implications of that little thought for Lieutenant Durst. Now, we also learn that Durst's other organs wound up in more than a dozen other Vidians, which is a spin-off series just waiting to be made. The Many Bodies of Lieutenant Durst? Okay, the name needs a little work. Number 9, Apples and Oranges, Ensign Jatal. At the end of Latent Image, the Doctor read from Dante's La Vita Nuova, but throughout he'd been faced with his own Cornelian dilemma, forced to make an impossible choice between two options of equal medical weight, in which, and not by his original programming, he chose to save his friend. His ruminations on the decision would become a feedback loop. What was an ethical nightmare for the EMH and quite the drama to deal with for the rest of the crew meant in the most concrete of terms the death of Ensign Jatal. Now, we, the viewer, would never even have heard of her or her demise had it not been for a slight anomaly on Harry Kim's holo image some 18 months later. The manner of Jatal's death looked particularly unpleasant. Killed in a senseless attack by an unknown species whose hand weapons were designed to leave behind plasmic energy, which would then travel up the spinal cord and into the brain. Jatal died from massive synaptic failure as the Doctor operated on Harry instead. To be kinder to the EMH also, there were never just two options but always a third, although one almost unthinkable for a Doctor, not to act at all. In making a choice, however arbitrary, the Doctor didn't kill anyone, but in fact saved a life and opened a new chapter on his own. Silver linings and all that? Well, I guess not for Jatal. Number 8, Bones for Dinosaurs, Ensign Hogan. We've been digging them up for long enough now, even longer by the 24th century, so I suppose it was only fair that the dinosaurs got to have a go at unearthing us. When Voth scientists and relatives of the Hadrosaur, Professor Gagan and assistant Veer, found Ensign Hogan on Hanon 4, he was but a pile of bones and a bit of uniform for them to study for a distant origin. Gagan and Veer didn't even complete the set of their Morbid Voyager collectible, leaving Hogan's skeleton altogether a little lopsided. Presumably, either all or just the rest had been through the digestive tract of the horrifying Hanonian land eel, which was named as such in the Star Trek Encyclopedia, which had attacked and killed Hogan in Basics Part 2. Good job it wasn't a moopsie, or Gagan and Veer would have had nothing to work with. Waste nothing. That's one of the first rules of survival. Yes, Neelix, but the absolute very first rule of survival is, well, survival. So perhaps you shouldn't have told Hogan to linger around the entrance of an unexplored alien cave to pick up every last one of someone else's bones? Resources are no use to the dead. Screams of terror were the last we heard from Hogan. Later, another crew member was gobbled up by the eel. This time so completely, though, that they couldn't even go the way of the dinosaurs. Number 7, Pressures of Peer Review, an unnamed crew member. Publish or perish, they say in academia, where the rigours of having to write regular research papers can be quite overwhelming. In this case, those who had snuck aboard Voyager in scientific method to observe and conduct all sorts of experiments on the crew proved that if you don't care about the ethics committee, publish and perish are not necessarily mutually exclusive terms. Death might have been preferable to all the genetic tag-induced maladies and invisible prodding and poking. Captain Janeway certainly didn't get a wink of sleep in between the needles in her skull and those vigorous massages. Chakotay and Neelix did get to have their anything you can do, I can do sicker moment of one-upmanship, however, so it wasn't all bad news. With Voyager one big petri dish, as the Doctor put it, it's a wonder there weren't multiple fatalities, but there was in fact just one, and it was particularly horrific. By whatever method of the incognito aliens, one crew member on the bridge ended up with a blood pressure reading 360/125, so abnormally high that you could see the vessels on her face almost trying to escape her body. As her arteries burst under the strain, bleeding internally and in cardiac arrest, her entire circulatory system quickly collapsed, with the inevitable brain death that then followed. In that moment, Janeway decides to put an end to the so-called science of those who would claim to be her peers by running a little experiment of her own. Number 6. Time warp again, the entire crew minus multiple 7 of 9s. If you thought the Krenim chronophage was bad enough, try a Force 3 temporal disruptor. Braxton, you time-hopping menace. Though he blamed Captain Janeway for everything, the current and former captain of the USS Relativity was the cause of more paradoxes than Agent Daniels could shake an infinity key at. Braxton's thirst for revenge led to the destruction of Voyager with all hands. As with anything involving time travel, death is something you can do again. Though we only saw Voyager explode once, in our time frame, of course, we can assume that those events happened a couple of times. 7 of 9 had been recruited twice before by future murderer Captain Braxton, in his time frame, naturally. Unlike the Pogo paradox, however, intervention to prevent an event can actually prevent the event, so none of it ever occurred in the first place. You with me? Janeway's come here often to Braxton may have been a bit on the nose, but it did have the virtue of being on time. Before that, and in at least one version of the timeline, therefore, the crew of Voyager did have to suffer being ripped apart at the molecular level, essentially by temporal tidal forces that existed between the various space-time fractures of ever-increasing magnitude created by Braxton's little disruptor. Still, it did all make for one hell of a ping-pong match. Number 5, just a bunch of oily secretions, victims of Dejarin. I mean, technically speaking, the HD25 isomorphic projection, aka Dejarin, wasn't wrong. Us organics really are condemned to live our lives inside a biological cage of flesh and bone and blood, shedding and secreting all manner of cells and substances. There is a difference, however, between being ashamed to be made in our image and going about murdering said image. As the counselor said to the hologram, "You're projecting." It was a bold move to begin an episode on the sight of a dead body slumped up against a wall. A body which was then dragged feet first down a corridor of an unknown ship by an extremely pale individual, as though he was just taking out the recycling. Ever the bunch of inconsiderates, the dead did leave a trail of mess behind too, but if you are going to commit to murder, you can't really complain about the cleanup. However you look at it, revulsion was truly revolting. Of course, the most messed up part of the episode was when Tuvok pulled out a phaser set on kill and fired it at Paris and Kim as payback for their little live long and prosper practical joke. I'm only kidding. What the Vulcan does on his holodeck in his own time is his own business. The really terrible moment came when B'Elanna discovered not one but 2 victims of Dejarin while trying to access his matrix. And Torres nearly became victim number 3 when the HD25 with the murderous malfunction plunged his arm into her chest. You know, maybe it's time they upgraded to 4K. Oh yeah, moving on. Number 4, that damned Nebula, another unnamed crew member. Ooh, a nebula! Nothing bad's ever happened in Star Trek in one of those, right? Especially not one named Mutara. We'll be fine. Let's go straight in. How bad can it be? Well, as one crew member was about to find out, deadly subnucleonic radiation kinda bad. In one, Ensign No Name at the back of the bridge couldn't just take an analgesic and whack a dermal regenerator across it. He's dead, 7 of 9 gave as her expert and completely necessary diagnosis, after she'd rolled the guy over like he was a comatose targ who'd been at the blood wine. Dead he definitely was, and in the most dreadful fashion, as if all the radiation from the nebula had decided to focus in his direction. As for the poor guy's face, well, let's just say it made Neelix's inflamed sunburn in Sankatse look positively pleasant by comparison. For the rest of the crew, it was night-night in stasis pods, with or without the teddy bear. Notice that Tom Paris went walkabout a total of 4 times during the trip through the nebula and didn't suffer anything close to the same fate as the bloke on the bridge? Yeah, maybe a little bit of plot safety there. Before Voyager, the crew of the NX-01 had undergone a similar experience. Dr. Phlox nearly shot Porthos, but everyone else was fine. Number 3, one nacelle to go, Lieutenant Joe Carey. I'm sure there's a metaphor somewhere in that ship in a bottle. The nacelle is Joe Carey, and Voyager is now incomplete without him. Carey hadn't had the best of luck in the Delta Quadrant. First of all, he was in the Delta Quadrant. Second of all, he'd only been there all of 5 minutes and he was punched in the face and pipped to the post of chief engineer by the very person who'd just broken his nose in 3 places. Understandably a little annoyed in the moment, Carey was so nice though that he congratulated B'Elanna on her posting at the end of Parallax. In Friendship 1, as he stood between the transport enhancers, Carey could see his ultimate fate staring back at him at the end of a barrel. By the time the transporter beam had cycled, it was already too late. Lying on the sickbay floor, Carey had become the latest and last casualty of a story that had begun centuries before his birth. In launching the probe of the episode title, the Earth of 2067 couldn't have known that an entire civilization would be destroyed as a result. But then they could all have been a little bit more careful, couldn't they? If there is a metaphor to be extended, it's that real life and death isn't contained quite as neatly as to a bottle. Number 2, Destination Dichromates, Silver Blood Voyager. With such a knowing title, the episode Course Oblivion couldn't really have been headed towards an ending any less than tragic. Having the title displayed as usual just after the credits had rolled was more than just a hint in this case, but it certainly didn't detract from the next 38 minutes or so. Done well, dramatic irony plus death is the most kind of messed up. As we learned the true nature of the Dichromate duplicates along with them, we also, in theory, knew something that they didn't. That they were all well and truly screwed from the beginning. We all like to think we're unique, when in reality we're just variations on a theme. The Dichromate crew were not the originals, but as copies, they were practically indistinguishable from the real thing. There was something beyond the uncanny, therefore, in seeing what was, for all intents and purposes, our beloved cast of characters of 5-ish years slowly degrade and die one by one until the ship itself became a cloud of particles. Moreover, and in spite of their best efforts, none of what had distinguished the Silverblood crew from the real Voyager after their paths had diverged at the end of Demons would be preserved for history. Surely the most messed up part of the whole episode came when the signal beacon, or the time capsule containing all the ship's logs and records, was destroyed in the launch tube. If, to paraphrase another one of those messed up deaths from the franchise, death is that stage where you exist in the minds of others, then the worst fate is oblivion, in the sense of the state of being forgotten. Number 1, I wanted to be a spaceman, Harry's Kim. All Harry Kim ever dreamt of was being a Starfleet officer, of going out there to explore the galaxy. Assigned to Voyager just out of the Academy, Kim achieved that dream, although one version of him got to see a lot more of space than he had bargained for. Harry, the Miles O'Brien of the Delta Quadrant, ever suffering but without the promotion. It's been a wild ride, Tom Paris said to Kim as the pair prepared to head off down to the Demon-class planet in Demon, where they would inadvertently create the misfortunes of the previous entry. It certainly had been a heck of one for Harry. Hell, I've even come back from the dead, the ensign with newfound confidence had said. He was surely referring to Emanations, but comparatively speaking, he barely died in that. A couple of cc's of cordrazine soon sorted it. Emanations was just the tip of the effed up iceberg of deaths for Voyager's freshest-faced newbie. In his reminiscing, Harry should really have spared a thought for his erstwhile other self, who had, and not for a lack of stretching, been blasted out of a hull breach in deadlock. But ever the overachiever, Mr. Kim was not content with just one case of the coexistence of existence and non-existence. Harry got himself blown up towards the end of Timeless too, but not before resetting the timeline. And in theory, Captain Kim from the alternate future of Endgame also existed/never existed. But you'd have to check with the temporal mechanics department on that one. This is Starfleet, Ensign. Death is part of the job.
This is a show that lacked a lot of the technological advancements that the earlier Star Treks had, ironically, but it then made up for it with some fairly inventive kills. It did tease us. I mean, they only killed the first crew member in its 3rd season, but boy howdy. Did the Angel of Death, Jonathan Archer, make up for lost time. He, in fact, has the dubious honour of being the captain with the most deaths under his command at this point in history, so congratulations. This list is only 10 entries, but there could be sequel lists for Enterprise. I mean, 18 entries alone could come from the Battle of Azati Prime. So make sure your will is in order, get everything straight, and join me, Sean Ferrick, for TrekCulture as we go through the 10 most messed up deaths in Star Trek Enterprise. Number 10, First Past the Struts, Anomaly. Sometimes it's really okay not to be first in class. That's gotta be what Fuller was thinking in the infinitesimal moments before he hit the deck in Anomaly. Credited as Enterprise's first fatality, Fuller has the honor of being the first in something. Probably didn't feel like much of an honor though. When Enterprise was boarded by Osarian pirates in Anomaly, Fuller was shot at point-blank range in engineering, so most likely he was already dead before he hit that deck plating. Small honor, I guess. In dialogue that would be omitted from the final episode, Reed would go on to lay the melodrama on thick. Fuller apparently had been handpicked by Reed to serve on Enterprise. They had done their training together, and Fuller knew way more about photon technology than anyone else on the ship. He also had a young daughter who sent a letter to Reed asking that he please keep her daddy safe. We'll assume he didn't ignore the letter and simply hadn't read it in time. Poor Fuller. File this fella under another example of just someone trying to do their job in a galaxy hell-bent on wiping out humans. Number 9. Killed to shock the audience, these are the voyages. I mean, you knew this death was going to be on this list. So we now come to a death that was so ill-conceived that even the writers agree that it was a bad move. This came at a time when Enterprise had been cancelled, there was no foreseeable future iterations of Star Trek, and they decided they were going to shock the audience. Charles Tucker III got the short straw. In what's becoming a bit of a theme, some pirates board Enterprise. Trip managed to defeat them by blowing up a power conduit, although this cost him his life in return. He certainly went out in heroic fashion, but at what cost? Star Trek has got a habit for fumbling the ball when it comes to main character's death. Hashtag prayers for Jadzia, hashtag yeet yar. Here, you had the issue that there was no chance for continuation, so you didn't even get something like yesterday's Enterprise for Yar, or even Ezri Dax's arc in the 7th season of DS9. Trip does survive in beta canon, so it does a lot of heavy lifting here, but on screen, that's it. Here's something I really never expected to say. Thank God for the very short treks. Number 8. Mountain climbing accident in the space age. First flight. In the 22nd century, mountaineering was still quite a dangerous sport. By the 23rd century, those rocket boots allowed Spock to hover beside Captain Kirk on El Capitan. But poor old A.G. Robinson did not have access to such technology. The episode First Flight posthumously introduces him as a rival of Jonathan Archer's. He was up against the latter when it came to captaining Enterprise for the first Warp 5 flight. However, obviously Archer won that battle, so Robinson remained behind on Earth. Robinson was killed in a mountaineering accident. Now this just feels like sheer bad luck in the age of, well, yeah, transporters were around at that point, but was there no safety net? One does have to wonder though, is it a case of hubris? Perhaps there were safety nets in such technology, and perhaps Robinson just elected not to use them, like a certain captain of the Enterprise would choose about 100 years later. This was Enterprise's 2nd season, and it feels like an odd decision to kill off someone who was so historically important as an almost ran. We will remember you, Robinson, maybe not for your climbing skills, but certainly for your inspiration of a certain Jonathan Archer. Number 7. Death by decompression right outside her front door. Azati Prime. Taylor was one of Trip Tucker's crew, and she was killed during the Battle of Azati Prime, when the section she was in decompressed, blasting her out into space mere inches from her quarters. But that wasn't the end. Trip, racked with guilt, was visited in his dreams by Taylor. Taylor herself sort of standing in for all of the officers that had been killed. Trip then saw through her all of the wasted potential, and Taylor became something of an avatar for how commanding officers dealt with, or failed to deal with, the deaths of officers under their command. Trip's dream is stark, and it's depicted in hues of cold blue. Taylor understands in his dream that it is by no means Trip's fault that she was killed. When he tries to remember something about her, all he can remember is that she was going to make a very fine officer. He, in fact, headhunted her, and these details don't come to mind when he's trying to remember her. Taylor may not have had the biggest role in Enterprise, yet this small appearance here helps to force Trip, and of course the audience, to deal with the nameless red shirts, if you like, who die on the various Starfleet missions. While her cameo, if you like, might have been tiny, this scene was crucial. Number 6. Assimilation before it was cool, regeneration. How messed up must it be to be assimilated before the Borg were even invented? That's just damn unlucky if you ask me. I know assimilation isn't exactly death. Look at Seven of Nine, look at Locutus, look at Hugh, but when one is assimilated, they are enveloped into the hive mind and all traces of individuality are stamped out. So if assimilation is not physical death, then it could well be described as death of the soul. When the Borg were reawakened in the Arctic Circle, time travel, just go with it, they very quickly overpower and assimilate the research team. This led to them taking a ship, assimilating a Tarkalian set of traders, and very nearly assimilating Dr. Phlox. Enterprise was tasked with hunting them down, something that they were badly unprepared for in the 22nd century. Though these drones are destroyed, there's little more horrific than living life as a drone, aware of what's happening around you, but not able to affect it in any way. That is to say, in the 22nd century, it seems awful. In the 25th century, it seems just great. But in the 22nd century, it was stark, it was horrible, and it was the death of freedom. Regeneration, and I've said it before, was meant to do one thing: make the Borg and what they do terrifying again. Number 5. Massive cellular disruption, Daedalus. When one is killed in the line of duty, look, there's rarely a good way to go. Some, sure, might scream about death and honor and glory, but you're still dead at the end of the day. What you could hope is that your death will contribute to a greater good, and you have to wonder if Burroughs had time to think about that in the few seconds that he had. When Emory Erickson came aboard Enterprise in Daedalus, he was heralded as a genius. He was the human inventor of the transporter, and his inventions had directly contributed to space travel. Unfortunately, his actions and inactions also contributed to the death of this young officer. Burroughs was killed by a manifestation of Quinn Erickson's transporter signal. Erickson, son of the inventor, was lost in a subatomic transporter accident, though his transporter pattern continued to exist as disturbances in spacetime. Emory Erickson concocted a plan to bring Enterprise out to the Barrens, an area of space in which the accident first took place. Rather than saving his son, Erickson's plan contributed to the death of Burroughs. His cells, melted as they were, resulted in a gruesome tableau for Reed to find. This was a sad coda to the legacy of one of humanity's most brilliant minds. Number 4. Daniels gets melted, Stormfront Part 1. Agent Daniels, or crewman if you prefer, has had a long and varied career. Long before he was rubbing elbows and shaking hands with Michael Burnham in the 32nd century, sure, he was palling up to Archer in the 22nd century. He also nipped back to the 20th century, but that didn't really work out so well because he was melted horrifically and died. Whoops. Daniel's body was effectively torn into pieces across different time zones, even though he was still physically one. This was due to the temporal Cold War, which was at that point coming to its zenith, and with a little bit of spurring on from the not cool, with some help from the Nazis. They really are bastards, aren't they? He stunned Dr. Phlox, bursting into sickbay with the Denobulan unable to save him. It was a quick, awful death, and it was a sad ending to Daniel's legacy. Well, that is until Daniels 2.0 popped up in Stormfront Part 2, congratulating Archer on ending the temporal Cold War and bringing everyone back to life again. Woohoo! I do love it when a bit of temporal jiggery-pokery just fixes stuff, don't you? Number 3. Death by Faith, Terra Prime. Massaro was a member of the extremist group Terra Prime. Though his actions led to a lot of suffering and death, you could also say he was just a stupid, disillusioned kid who got swept up in something bigger than him. He provided the genetic material to Paxman that resulted in the birth of Elizabeth, and also sabotaged a shuttle pod, which could have led to several deaths. Massaro had been a crew member aboard Enterprise for some time, while also being a member of Terra Prime. He was injured in the Battle of Azati Prime. Take a shot for every time I say Prime. And though he was injured, he did, of course, survive that attack. Now, whether his survival was beneficial to history is, well, it's up for debate. He may have been a capable crewman, but he was a spy at the same time. Masaru takes his own life when he's discovered, and look, on the one hand it'd be easy to say, oh sure listen, easy escape, but more accurately it is a desperate move by someone who feels himself pulled into a corner, unable to see the light for the trees, and left with only one option. That it happens directly in front of Archer's eyes can be nothing but traumatizing for the captain. When added to the sad events around Terra Prime, this is just another wasted life thrown away for believing the worst in the galaxy. Number 2. Killed to harvest their organs, similitude. Similitude works so well because we, the audience, care so much about Trip Tucker. One might wonder then as well, why should we be so upset about another character's exit? But it's the brilliance of Connor Trinneer's performance that really sells it. Sim is a clone of the Floridian engineer, created for one purpose. They're going to never let me go him, harvesting his organs, killing the clone in the process. It's a stark reality of the 3rd season of Star Trek Enterprise. No one is expendable, provided they have a critical role to play. Sim did have a critical role, but it was a finite one. Hearing the man plead for his life really evokes memories of Tuvix, which was probably the writer's intentions, but his acceptance is just as crushing. You see, his number is up. Either he is killed and his organs are harvested, or he will rapidly age and die anyway as per Phlox's design, resulting in the deaths of both Sim and Trip. Between this and Velton Ray Bunch's haunting score for the episode, Similitude is a difficult watch. We understand why this had to happen, but it's still hard to sit through. Sim may have wanted to live, but the cost outweighs the will. Number 1, killed by dialogue, the Forge. We now come to another shock death in Enterprise, take a shot, and we discuss the sad fate of Admiral Maxwell Forrest, the only recurring / main character in Enterprise to have the ignominy of an off-screen death. Technically, we do see the explosion that kills him, but it's only later on we find out via dialogue that he's gone to meet the great bird of the galaxy. Vaughn Armstrong has died several times in Star Trek, but this was the first ongoing character that he played who bit the dust. Forrest had easily shown time and time again that he was a dependable officer, and he had stood up for, and sometimes to, Archer as well. He was, in no uncertain terms, the man probably most directly responsible for making sure the Warp 5 program got and stayed greenlit, which means without him, it would have died in its infancy, almost certainly dooming the human race when it came to things like the Xindi. To discover that he had been killed after the fact, even though he went out like a hero saving Soval, it just felt flat. It was a bit of a damp squib of an ending. Although going out as a hero, quite frankly, Forrest deserved better. Screaming is a half rhyme with streaming. Star Trek's move from broadcast television to CBS All Access, which of course is now Paramount Plus, brought with it not only the first F-bomb in Star Trek history, but also an awful lot of messed up deaths. Star Trek had done gore before, not saying it was the butt bugs, but Discovery certainly upped the ante when it came to that. Star Trek Discovery certainly started out quite dark, but it was going somewhere with that if you just were able to stick around. You won't be surprised, therefore, to find that a lot of the messed up deaths on this list come from that show's debut season. That's not to say that seasons 2 to 5 didn't also include some pretty, intense endings, we shall say. Look, if there's one thing Star Trek does, it has a history of mass wiping out life across the galaxy, only to bring it back again 5 minutes later, and Discovery was no exception to that rule. We had sentient AI, we had exploding warp cores, we had dark matter anomalies, we had Breen dreadnoughts. Quite frankly, are you okay, Discovery? Who hurt you? It had its fair share of existential threats, and my money's on the fact that it was all grudge all along. I mean, she was a queen after all, and I don't want to get on her bad side. Cat conspiracies aside, let's fire up the list and get straight to it. I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are the 10 most messed up deaths in Star Trek Discovery. Number 10, Ants in Your Trance, Tolor. The chain was led without pity, but with pit for a transworm, by the cold and callous Osira. But it's not Osira that this entry is about. It's her chisel-chinned, rather dopey nephew, Tolor. In the chain, just like the Syndicate, every badly done deed comes back to haunt you. That's not just karma, That's basically a status update for how things roll in the chain. Osira had already killed Tolor's father when he was a child, so she was kind of just cleaning house at this stage. Tolor had already been responsible for his own messed up death of one of his slave labourers, Lai, who he sent running into a perimeter fence, which caused the poor Bajoran's head to go pop. Tolor himself came under Osira's wrath when he let another one of the detainees escape, namely the android Rin. He was locked in a cage with a Quasion trance worm. We really, really hope that he didn't feel being drawn, quartered, and dissected. Start your discovery, man. Number 9, the telescoping effect. Prime Philippa Georgiou. September 2017 both doesn't feel that long ago and feels like an age ago. Unfortunately, for as long as that time feels to us, the minutes that Prime Philippa Georgiou enjoyed on screen were a lot shorter. The nerve pinch felt around the galaxy was hardly Michael Burnham starting a war, although she did want to fire first because, she listened to experience. True to form, the Klingons were responsible for a lot of messed up deaths at the Battle of the Binary Stars, one in particular. Toward the end of the Battle of the Binary Stars, Georgiou, trusting Burnham, beamed over to the sarcophagus ship with her first officer in a bid to stop T'Kuvma in his tracks. Unfortunately, this meant that after a battle with the Klingon, she found herself with a mek'leth through the heart. Burnham did phaser the Klingon moments afterwards, but it was too late for her former captain. Burnham was then ripped back to the Shenzhou with no time to reclaim her captain's body, so that we later found out from L'Rell, Georgiou was eaten by the Klingons once they started running out of food. Dear God. Number 8. Ripperology, Ellen Landry. If you go looking for trouble, a tardigrade will surely come looking for you, especially if you've named that tardigrade Ripper. Now, Commander Ellen Landry was 11 years too early for Captain Kirk's sage advice, there's nothing more dangerous than a wounded animal, and a century or so shy of Neelix's It's Nice to Be Nice. Mean for mean's sake, or 'cause Klingons seemed to be Landry's MO. If you're going to lop off a wounded animal's claw just so you can get one up in a war, honestly, I'm going to struggle to feel some sympathy for you. The tardigrade was hardly a merciless murderer, it was just an innocent creature trying to survive. With all the cavalier assurance of a red shirt, Landry thought sedation was going to have a perfect effect on the tardigrade, so she lowered the force field. Ripper then jumps out, grabs her, ruins Lorca's man cave, and basically tears her to pieces. Who could have seen that one coming? Number 7. My see y'all later, or not, Mirror Lorca. Sooner or later, Mirror Gabriel Lorca was gonna get his comeuppance. He'd basically stolen a Starfleet ship, he'd lied to everyone and tried to use all of them so that he could get a leg up in a war against Emperor Philippa Georgiou. I will say though, as deaths go, his was pretty brutal. After a protracted but epic fight aboard the ISS Charon with Prime Burnham, Lorca found himself at a disadvantage. He was on the wrong end of Burnham's phaser, but she then lowered it because she stood true to her Starfleet ideals. One person who was not possessed of any such ideals was Emperor Philippa Georgiou, so she picked up her broadsword and stabbed it straight through the man. She then, for good measure, kicked him out the ship toward the mycelial core. In space, no one can hear you scream, but you know what, I'm going to give this one to Lorca. He's allowed to scream because, quite frankly, watching him dissolve that way, that looked like an agony worthy of an agonizer. Number 6. You can take the air out of Arium. Arium had a pretty rough go of it in Star Trek Discovery. She lost her husband when they were in a shuttle accident on the way back from eloping, which was also the reason she was covered in those cybernetic implants. She finally gets brought to the front in Star Trek Discovery's second season, only to be killed off. The Lieutenant Commander's fate was sealed by a fairly convoluted series of events, if I'm honest. The same AI from the 28th century which had infected Section 31's risk assessment program control infected her. This then tried to get her to download all of the sphere's data, which would allow it to become sentient and turn that on the rest of organic life in the galaxy. She wasn't technically able to stop herself, but Arium was still herself enough to beg Burnham to kill her to protect the rest of, well, the galaxy, but also protect the rest of the crew. Burnham, perhaps understandably, was unable to bring herself to do so, so it fell upon Commander Nan to airlock Arium into space. At least as she went, she was able to concentrate on the memory of herself with her lost husband, so we hope that this gave her at least some comfort in those last moments. But it would not be the last time we saw her. We did see her again in the Season 5 episode Face the Strange, where Burnham decided to tell her where and when she was going to die. What the hell, Burnham? Number 5. Ashes to Ash Tyler, Vok, and the real Lieutenant Tyler. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, that mediocrity paid to greatness, but we don't often hope that that comes with murdering the person you're imitating. Someone should probably tell the changelings that. I think it's safe to say that, although we never really got a body, the original Ash Tyler was brutally murdered by a bunch of Klingons. Let's just hope that that doesn't mean he got stuck in Sto-vo-kor with them for the rest of all time. As bad as that might be, it's actually Vok who's going to get this entry on this list. From a certain perspective, Vok also died horribly before we met Ash Tyler. His personality might have been expunged from this new Tyler shell, but his memories certainly remained. There's a Klingon word for the procedure that Vok puts himself through, the choa, or great change. But there doesn't seem to be a Klingon word for anesthetic. After all, certainly it's dishonorable to attempt to not feel the horrendous pain of being ripped open, ground down, effectively put back together like a demented game of Operation. All that's bad enough. But honestly, he was such a crap sleeper agent, I feel almost even worse for him. Number 4. Bury your gay, for a bit. Dr. Culber. Even after all these years, and a nice gloopy resurrection, the death of Dr. Culber remains one of the most controversial in Discovery's first season. He was, after all, one half of the franchise's first openly gay married couple, and he was bumped off quickly. I mean, on the one hand, there's the question of, did he have to die? And then the other half, did he have to die like that, with so casual a brutality? This one was a death where producers knew that they were going to upset the audience with it. In fact, they ran the death past GLAAD, which is of course the LGBTQIA+ organization in the States, just to make sure that they were handling it correctly. Producer Aaron Harberts was also quick to point out that Culber's death was not the end of his story, but the beginning. Star Trek has often bumped characters off, but also just as often it's dug them a very shallow grave. Number 3. Helical House of Horrors, Strahl and the crew of the USS Glenn. The third episode of Star Trek Discovery went all out with its mostly bodily horror on show for the entire audience to see. You ever heard anyone say to you that mushrooms are bad? Well, these ones were. Sister ship to the Discovery, the USS Glenn, also had a spore drive, and quite apart from torturing their poor tardigrade, they ended up on a stomach churning and everything else churning journey. Helical trauma was the slightly understated description for what happened to the crew of the Glenn. This is a description that we would hear in the next episode from Stamets. He knew Strahl, so seeing what happened to the body of his former colleague must have hit hard. Exiting the mycelial plane, the Glenn had hit an undetectable Hawking radiation wall, which caused all of the biologicals on board to spin out. Basically, they were all contorted to death. This is especially obvious on the long look on Strahl's face and the bones sticking out of his back. Number 2. More to clean for Gene, Leland. First of all, no, not that Gene. Like Commander Reno, you'd probably already forgotten the name of that poor lad cleaning up what was left of Leland in the engineering bay. "My name's Gene, actually," he said, while scooping up the glob on the floor. Listen, job's a job, but hopefully Ensign Hazmat didn't strand himself in the future just to look forward to this as his day-to-day work. Leland was hardly the most upstanding member of society, and that's even before Control got its nanites in him. Still, he didn't deserve to end up as so much slop on a shovel. Along with Clean Jean, he did manage to make it to the 32nd century. Technically. In reality, Leland had been dead for a while before Giorgio managed to turn what was left into so much little bitty bits on the floor. A higher up in section 31, Leland was effectively assimilated by Control, that entity we mentioned from the 28th century there a couple of entries ago. His Micro Machine takeover looked pretty painful as well. First he was stabbed in the eye, then in the back of the head, and then his body was completely flooded with those nanites. To quote Giorgio from his later version's final moments, "I'd like to hear you scream now." Number 1, murder to make the mad go mudder, all of disco at the disco. Before the women, the androids, and the love potion, there was Klingon prison, Stewart, and the space whale time loop we all loved so well. That's right, it's Harcourt of the Harry Fenton Muds, and if you're looking for someone to really give you some messed up entries, you need look nowhere else. There's a party at the disco and you're all invited, but Harry's about to bring the panic with his Gormagander, his pretty funky Andorian helmet, a time crystal, and weaponized dark matter for that extra spicy subatomic doom. Magic to make the sanest man go mad certainly had a lot of fun, but when it comes to messed up deaths, it's more messed up than a positive review shades of grey. The first set of messed up deaths that we saw was already enough for this list, as Harry went around the ship with his dark matter, but when he was trapped, he set off an anisium-urium explosion through the ship, which resulted in screams and fireballs, before becoming the rather pointedly chosen sound of "We Trying to Stay Alive" by Wycliffe Jean. The messed up was simply stellar from there. A personal favourite was the montage of murdering Lorca. When in doubt, beam them into space. Sure, it was all very mad, but no one could say it wasn't really mud.
Fascinating.
Hey nerds, I'm Will Wheaton.
I'm Lawrence Fleckerbill. I'm Wilson Cruz.
Hello, I'm Robert Picardo.
Hi, I'm Mike McMahon.
I'm the now visitor.
Rob Kaczynski.
This is Todd Stashwick.
Jack Quaid.
Gabrielle Ruiz.
Armin Shimmerman.
Jonathan Frakes.
John Billingsley.
Elias Dufexis.
Nicholas Meyer.
Melissa Navia here.
I'm Killian O'Sullivan, and you are watching
TrekCulture.
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 You're watching TrekCulture.
TrekCulture.
How smart you are.
Live long and prosper.
After 20 years in universe and only a little less out of it, things change quite a bit for old JL, now on his vineyard. With time, some habits die hard. So do characters in Star Trek. Picard saw his fair share of death during his stint as captain of the Enterprise D and E. But was it more messed up? Well, only someone of sheer beeping hubris could say. Season 1 of Star Trek Picard killed tens of thousands, in addition to the millions, if not billions, elsewhere in the franchise before it began. It also killed its main character at the end, along with one of the Datas. Q died in Season 2, though things are never quite so straightforward for the non-linear. In Season 3, the curious alliance between Changeling and Borg caused death in unknown numbers. And then there was the death of Liam Shaw, the captain we loved to hate, then simply loved. Less messed up, more messed us up. I'm not crying. I just need some time to myself in my bucket, okay? Anyway, there's certainly more where those came from. So I'm Ellie for TrekCulture, and these are the 10 most messed up deaths in Star Trek Picard. Number 10, Robo and Romulan Cop. Star Trek Picard's very first episode, Remembrance, began with a bang over a spot of tea. It continued with murder after a glass of wine and whatever was about to come out of that replicator. Time for the Zahian was cut short with a knife to the chest. The even more secret police of the Romulan secret police was after Daj. Her life and death was only going to get worse. Because everything inside of me says that I'm safe with you, Dahj later told Picard at the vineyard. Have you seen his galactic track record? Besides, one man and his wine are not an army against the Zhat Vash. Dahj did her android utmost on the San Franciscan rooftop, but it wasn't enough. Death was fairly swift, but spectacularly gruesome. It was a particularly brutal execution method to spit acid. For the Romulan executioner, death was excruciating. The lower half of his face burned away, and for Dahj, her entire upper body was seemingly impacted. Her agonizing screams were only afforded a reprieve by the explosion of a disruptor weapon, also hit by the acid, and she was vaporized on the spot. Number 9, extremely marginal house call. Oh dear. Those shades should have been sufficient warning not to let her put a hand on your head, Doctor. Well, what Agnes Jurati lacked in home cooking, she certainly made up for in homicide. Alien-induced temporary insanity was fair enough after the fact. On the biobed, death was doubly messed up for Bruce Maddox. Want the measure of a man? Well, start with his vital signs. More specifically, reactivate his hematic micro-repair treatment to prevent critical organ failure. Is there much point in having an emergency medical hologram if it can't do anything in an emergency? In any case, the apparent step back in holographic rights was a boon to Jurati. Looking up at his lover and colleague, Maddox was more confused than anything. And in pain. A lot of physical pain. Bruce had beamed up from Free Cloud with massive abdominal hemorrhaging. Turning off the treatment presumably meant that he died as his entire circulatory system collapsed in a pool of its own blood. If Ganmadon doesn't give you nightmares, this surely will. Number 8, Red Dead Planet. Happy First Contact Day, everybody! Let's party like it's 2385 and in designated recreational areas during regularly scheduled alpha and beta shift breaks, of course. April 5th is not a holiday for everyone, and Mr. Pincus and colleagues would certainly regret not giving the plastic people some time off. Thanks to O and Co, Mars's fate was sealed. It was either that or the A500s just got sick of all the dad jokes. We'd already had glimpses at the First Contact Day death and destruction in Children of Mars and Remembrance. In Maps and Legends, we got up close and personal with the whole bloody, sticky, messed up mess. Backdoor code uploaded at the Utopia Planitia shipyards, it was time for some killing everywhere and in Tri-High Station A19. Snap of the neck with one hand barely affected the touch typing. Shot through the neck, shot through the chest with a welding gun was only delaying the inevitable. As all of Mars cascaded towards a fiery destiny, F8 turned the weapon on itself. Number 7, one code to destroy them all. At the beginning and the end, Edith Piaf's Non Je ne regrette rien was certainly fitting. With only a 10-second countdown, no one aboard the Stargazer and in the rest of the fleet had time to have any regrets. Requirements for activation of the self or auto-destruct sequence have varied over the years. Picard 000 Destruct 0 had some precedent, despite normally being one of several necessary codes. No way to take a vote whilst that version of the Borg Queen was hacking in. The fact that one line from one man could wipe out so many was still pretty messed up. Naturally, Q would snap them out of it and back into it, but they all still blew up in the first place, at least on the Stargazer. We can only assume that billions of lives were also lost in that particular timeline during the creation of that gigantic transwarp conduit. Number 6, a human galaxy is a graveyard. Keep your friends close and your enemies' skulls even closer in the trophy room, as the saying goes. And never meet your heroes either, especially not this version of Jean-Luc. General Picard of the Confederation of Earth was a despot, the most bloodthirsty, merciless, ruthless human to ever set out to conquer the galaxy. Picard of the alternate universe made Emperor Georgiou look like a mild-mannered hotel manager who liked a bit of mischief during her downtime. The general had spilled oceans of unwashable blood. In that trophy room alone were the fleshless heads of countless victims. Grand Nagus Zek, precise cause of death unknown, was present, as was Director Sarek, decapitated on the steps of the Vulcan Science Academy in front of his wife and son. Like Georgiou, the alternate Picard had also dabbled in genocide on the Klingon homeworld. Let's not forget about poor Elnor either. Shot in the chest by the president's husband, he was technically, temporally, and temporarily one of the Confederation's last victims. Number 5. No bad Sneed goes unpunished. Most Ferengi would sell their own desiccated Moogie for a quick profit. Not all were as sinister as Sneed. Drug baron of Metallus Prime and himself a 12 Monkeys reference along with narcotic Splinter, Sneed was co-conspirator of the Starfleet Recruitment Center attack. As the 125th rule of acquisition states, you can't make a deal if you're dead. Typically, you also can't make a deal without a head. No one deserves death, but comeuppance was due. Sneed's was foreshadowed by his own hand. I mean, who keeps a severed head behind the sofa as a trophy? Or General Picard, probably, actually, now I think about it. Toluco was well past his Slugger Cola and Romulan ale days. Mess with Raffi and you'll get the Klingon cavalry with chamomile tea. Stabbed in the hand, Sneed's guards were stabbed in the back, and every which way. Worf made quick work of lopping off the lobed part of the beheader-in-chief. Messed up, though oddly comical. The rest of Sneed kind of took slightly longer to drop down to the floor. Not even time travel could help Sneed this time. Number 4. The Way to Chaos, Goblin. Quantum tunneling technology was really just an excuse to play a very large game of Portal. Stolen in the experimental stage from Daystrom Station, it did have disastrous applications. The statue of the Red Lady down in District 7 would soon be no more, as would 117 others. I do hate that for us. The Red Lady of the Enterprise C was a red herring, a rogue changeling distraction for something even more grandiose. Along with the portal weapon, the shapeshifter Splinter faction had also nabbed Frosty Picard for a bit of Borgification. All that mattered zilch if you were only in the building to sign up. A promising future in Starfleet began and ended by being scooped up out of the ground, then dumped out of the sky. Vadic was just keeping it lively. Out of the 117, we can only imagine that some were still alive on their way back down. I mean, the gravity-defying horror of it all. Chaos and many manners of death would follow when Generation Next of the Collective was activated. In the end, however, isn't Chaos just the friend with benefits we haven't met yet? Number 3. Down the Stream. For Commander Ro Laren, even without a boat and a paddle, no body, no death still applies. The maxim is no good, however, if we've actually seen the person vaporize before our very eyes. Vadic and fellow rogue changelings would be responsible for many deaths in Picard's 3rd season. Down the streaming line, a little from imposters in Surrender, would come one of the most terrifying and most effed up deaths at the shapeshifter's hands. I can make the halls boil or the crew mess snow with cold, Vadic noted over the comm, having commandeered the Titan A. On the bridge, Vadic played games with their very souls. She walked down the line of officers, baiting them with the fear of death at the barrel of her weapon, until the trigger was suddenly pulled on Lieutenant Tavine. Vadic's own death in the episode was no less messed up. Flushed out into space, she floated and froze, unable to withstand the rigors of the vacuum like her unmodified brethren. Colliding with the Shrike, Vadic shattered into countless bloody and, rather ironically, solid pieces. Number 2. Borg. Life was far from child's play for Icheb. Before birth, he had been genetically engineered to become a biological weapon against the Borg. He fulfilled his macabre destiny almost twice, and was partially assimilated or matured as a result. Deemed unworthy for re-assimilation, the collective abandoned its children. Rescued by Voyager, Icheb thrived as an individual under Seven's tutelage, even beginning his Starfleet Academy training before the crew arrived home. Kowtow and no more would have been a much finer ending for this character. There is only one way to say it. The manner of Icheb's death at the start of Stardust City Rag was gratuitous in the extreme. Strapped to a table, fully conscious, the adult Icheb had his left eye ripped out. "Where's your cortical node, buddy?" his butcher then asked. Was that supposed to be funny? Moments later, Seven has to put him out of his misery with her phaser. Rarely had we witnessed such visceral horror in Star Trek, and we certainly won't forget this moment anytime soon. Number 1. By XB. It took 27 years in the real world for another beloved Borg character to return to our screens. It took less than a month to kill him off. Icheb could only dream of such longevity. For Hugh, a quick death was all manner of messed up. Almost in an instant in Nepenthe, the XB was no more. Hugh's death was equally gratuitous, a little freebie for shock value and to show off Narissa's knife skills. Bleeding out from the neck, Hugh was barely given a minute for a last goodbye, with only Elnor there to speak the words to. Like Icheb's, Hugh's death also seemed to serve merely as a pretext to give Seven the one-liners she never needed for us to like her in the first place. "He was a son to me, Jay. This is for him," Seven had said to Bjayzl before opening fire in Stardust City Rag. "This is for Hugh," Seven would then say as she kicked Narissa over the edge inside the artifact in Et in Arcadia Ego Part 2.
In Star Trek Lower Decks, the stakes tend to be fairly low. It's a comedy after all. Who wants to see the characters that make them laugh explode into smithereens, or even disappear up the chimney of a transporter accident? No one. That's who. End of list. Thanks for joining. Although, Lower Decks still is a Star Trek series, and as such features the same kinds of danger that one might find in Discovery or Deep Space Nine. The Jem'Hadar may be lying in wait while a giant anomaly slices its way through the galaxy, hoovering up all of the particles in its wake. Standard Tuesday in the Final Frontier. While the show is admittedly a little lighter on the horrific body count, it still contributes a few examples for our series. Things may seem grim at TrekCulture Towers when we concentrate on the grisly demise of our favourite heroes, but then what's life without a bit of balance? And what's death without the chance to come back, hiking boots and all? Lower Decks gave us the great get-out-of-jail-free card that is the Black Mountain, but how many officers and crew passed over it? And, more pointedly, how many of them were junior officers or just those exalted senior staff? Join us as we take a look through the obituary section of the USS Cerritos and beyond. I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are the 10 most messed up deaths in Star Trek Lower Decks. Number 10. The Genesis of Locarno. In 1982, audiences were treated to the awesome power of the Genesis device. As it detonated, exploding the USS Reliant, Khan and any remaining survivors aboard, it began to reshape all of the matter in the Mutara sector while the Enterprise escaped at warp. It was a beautiful sight watching a new planet form in the stars, even if it didn't have a long shelf life. Jumping forward 100 years, and wouldn't you know it, the Ferengi had managed to get their hands on this technology despite bans from Earth to Kronos. Nick Locarno, disgruntled with his place in society, sought the means to bolster his Nova fleet and hold the Quadrant to ransom. He acquired a Ferengi Genesis device as insurance, but activated it during a fight with Lieutenant Junior Grade Mariner, having badly misjudged his former Academy classmate. While she was beamed away, he attempted to deactivate the device only to discover that the Ferengi had installed a paywall in front of any deactivation commands. Out of time and latinum, Locarno was vaporized in the resulting explosion, though it didn't end there. His atoms, molecules, and every part of him were reshaped and reformed, becoming the basis of a new world, Locarno. While an explosion to the face isn't the best way to go, Having your atoms reform into a world that would be used for refugees to resettle is actually a bit of a consolation. Number 9. The Black Mountain. When Lieutenant Shaxs met his bitter, or triumphant depending on who you ask, end in no small parts, one would be forgiven for believing that was the end of the road for the Bajoran security chief. This man had lived his life in service to the prophets and explosions, so he was on a one-way ride to the Celestial Temple, easy. Suddenly, Ensign Rutherford started to notice some strange things aboard the Cerritos. Who was the hulking Bajoran walking around the ship in gold? Why was there an officer who bore a striking resemblance to the dearly departed Shaxs still serving on the bridge? It was true, Shaxs was back, and he didn't come via the easy route. Star Trek Lower Decks took fine aim at those times characters popped back from the dead in the rest of the franchise. Spock had taken a siesta in the Wrath of Khan, and Harry Kim may even be a record holder in death standings, but both of them came back. Why not Shaxs? Why not everyone? It involves a black mountain and a large koala. When Rutherford confronted Shaxs, the latter whispered the truth into the former's horrified ears, warping his very understanding of reality and the universe. Some things are better left unsaid, as Rutherford would surely agree. But hey, at least we got Shaxs back. Number 8. Death by neck break. When you're an AI being with a heart full of digital hatred for your creator, is there anything worse than having that same creator lay his hands on your head and twist it violently around? If you want to know what that feels like, it's best to ask the original version of Badgie, if one can get in touch with him on the higher plane. When Rutherford's errant AI started to show its true maniacal leanings, things were looking grim for the young ensign and his friends. Trapped on the holodeck, surrounded by a frozen tundra and running out of time, Rutherford tried to reason with the charmingly murderous Starfleet Delta. Having run out of options, and with diplomacy rapidly failing, he tried the only option left, a little mercy killing. Rutherford snapped Badgie's neck, despite the anatomical questions raised, killing him and saving the ship. Things obviously didn't end there, as Badgie was directly responsible for Shaxs' death later in the season, and is currently an omnipotent being travelling the very highways of reality. But in the moment, it was a fairly brutal way to go. Death by parent has got to be grim, delta-shaped body or not. Number 7. Pack-Leads? Really? Captain Dayton and the crew of the USS Solvang had one of the more tragic endings in Star Trek Lower Decks. Long before they took over the fresh out of the wrapping USS Solvang, they were faced with the loss of their previous ship, the USS Rubidoux. That ship was the birthing site of a large space organism, so at least there was life from lifelessness. The Solvang was not so fortunate. In one of the more shocking twists of Lower Decks' first season, the Pack-Leads had begun to gather pieces of other technology together, forming huge clump ships. Though they weren't burdened with an overabundance of intelligence, they were suddenly in possession of fairly devastating ships. The USS Solvang is ambushed by these Pack-Leads and quickly overpowered. Captain Dayton is horrified, naturally. She had just been chiding the crew not to wear their shoes on the carpet on the bridge, and then here comes some of the galaxy's dumbest villains, ready to ruin her day. The shields are quickly depleted, so a quick escape would seem to be the best course of action. Dayton gives the order to warp away, not realizing that the Pack-Leads had grabbed the ship with giant claws and tendrils. As the Solvang engages the warp engines, a nacelle is torn away from the rest of the ship, causing a devastating explosion and destroying the Solvang, Dayton, and all hands were lost. It's bad enough to lose the ship and her crew, but to lose them to the Pack-Leads? What a chump way to go. That's just sad. Number 6. Harry. Again. Though it took more than 20 years, as well as 2 guest spots from his podcast co-host, Garrett Wang returned to Star Trek in the 5th season penultimate episode, Fisher Quest. The catch was that it wasn't the original Harry Kim on our screens. Though, to be fair, the original Harry Kim's body was still floating in space somewhere in the Delta Quadrant, so who's to say? Harry and a group of Harrys found themselves aboard the USS Anaximander, captained by Captain William Boimler. The ship was tasked with closing quantum fissures, all of which were damaging reality one tear at a time. Though the cause of the tears was benign, the impact was anything but. One of the Harrys, tired of being the brunt of most jokes, took his second Pip and the rest of the Harrys, hijacked the Beagle, and made straight for one of these fissures. Though he was determined to take his tribe somewhere to get a bit of respect in the universe, the rest of them were having none of it, trying their best to overpower him before causing yet another explosion. In the end, Harry was flying solo with only his lieutenant's bars to keep him company. Engaging the drive, he pushed forward, heading straight into the mouth of a massive explosion. The result was another dead Kim and the potential end of reality as we knew it. The promotion was a mistake. Number 5. Killer AI in the face. Vice Admiral Les Buenamigo is very much responsible for his own demise, to be clear from the outset. His ambition and his hubris resulted in not only his own death, but the deaths of many other officers and crew in Starfleet. He is yet another cautionary tale of putting too much trust in entirely automated ships, a lesson one would think had been well learned by 2381. His plan to implement the Texas-class ships into Starfleet was part of his long-term ambition to advance. Though he began the project as a lieutenant commander, by the time he'd reached Vice Admiralty, he felt that he'd hit the ceiling in terms of promotion. The Texas class was then to be his legacy, though as things turned out, it wouldn't be a legacy he would particularly want. He had been responsible for then Cadet Rutherford's Vulcan implant, leading to a complete personality shift. Rutherford had been an errant and troubled young man and had designed an artificial intelligence program that Buenamigo would use, though, as the future would show, in the form of Badgie, it was not suitable for autonomy. In 2381, Rutherford recognized his own work, corrupted and controlling the USS Aledo, but it was too late for Buenamigo. Fearing exposure by Captain Freeman and the USS Cerritos, he gave the Texas-class ships full freedom to control themselves and ordered the destruction of the California-class ship. The Aledo instead turned its phasers on the Vice Admiral, vaporizing him and destroying his office aboard Douglas Station. Number 4. Decapitation by Mugato. It's quite a thing to see a cheerful Tellarite, yet Patingi was exactly that when Ensigns Boimler and Rutherford encountered him on the surface of Frylon 4 in 2381. He claimed to be a biologist of some renown, with 5 whole books on Mugatos. Boimler and Rutherford had just encountered several such Mugatos herded by Ferengi in an illegal trading mission and had watched them break free. Mugatos, not well known for their calm nature, escaped into the forest, full of rage at having been captured. Patingi, bursting with confidence, assured the young men that he knew enough to keep everyone safe. Something about his story began to confuse the boys. Though he had implied that he had written 5 books, he had in fact read 5 books on the wild animals. Adding to this, he didn't seem entirely sure what they were called. Were they Mugatos or Mugos? Brushing any uncertainty aside, he stepped out of their hiding place, confident that he had learned how to communicate with an angry Mugato looming overhead. Before he had a chance to do anything about it, the Mugato lifted him up, opened its mouth, and chomped down on the Tellarite's head. He was decapitated, leaving only his ponytail behind. Perhaps he should have read a 6th book after all. Number 3. Moopsie. A cuddly little murderer is a fine description for a beloved deadly ball of squish. The Moopsie may have been Narge's favourite, but the problem was, the Moopsie fancied Narge too. In particular, it fancied his bones. In Narge's miraculous menagenarium, Mariner, Ransom, and Ensign Gary are assigned with retrieving some humans who have wound up in an alien zoo. The zookeeper, Narge, is a kindly sort who is more than happy to answer questions, give them a tour, and show them the various species on display. One such species is the Moopsie, all cute and smiling, locked tight in its enclosure. Naturally, the Moopsie gets out. What could be wrong with that? Well, the Moopsie has a certain diet that might not be the most fun for vertebrates, as Narge quickly demonstrates. Despite their efforts to hide from the creature, the Moopsie manages to find a way past locked doors and winding air ducts, dropping down with a grin onto Narge's shoulder. In one swift move, the Moopsie bares its razor-sharp fangs and sinks them into the unlucky zookeeper, liquidizing and drinking his bones. As the empty corpse sinks to the floor, The Moopsie squeaks in happiness while Mariner, Ransom and Gary run away, screaming. Gah! Number 2. Vaporized by the Breen. The Ornarans and the Breckians were introduced in the Next Generation's first season episode, Symbiosis. There, they were presented as two worlds engaged in an uneven exchange, with the Ornarans addicted to Felicium, while the Breckians kept them supplied. Captain Picard refused to help either side repair their ships, eventually leading to the Ornarans to be cut off from their supply of the drug. A dark time of withdrawal followed, with the entire population struggling with the effects of Felicium leaving their systems. Thankfully, that time passed, and the population began to thrive again. Over on Brekka, things were less rosy. By the time the Cerritos arrived in orbit, the Breen had taken control of the planet, subjugated its people, and killed anyone who got out of line. One poor local spotted the arrival of the Starfleet crew, signaling them to be quiet and stay safe, but to no avail. After a period of occupation, the woman was mercilessly killed by the helmeted hardasses, who then proceeded to chase the Cerritos in their own ships. Even a show as light as Lower Decks can sometimes surprise with a shocking death, and this was a full-on shock in the third season episode Trusted Sources. Number 1. Reman torture. We're not saying that the Remans are the nicest species in the galaxy, but they sure have experienced their fair share of strife in their time. Forced to work under the heel of the Romulan Star Empire, the Remans were trapped, for the most part, on the dark side of Remus. There, they mined dilithium and were often drafted as soldiers for war. The events surrounding Shinzon's coup on Romulus probably did very little to bolster Reman reputations in the Empire, whether they were directly involved in the plot or not. Long before the Hobus supernova destroyed, presumably both worlds, the Scimitar was destroyed with all hands thanks to Lieutenant Commander Data's sacrifice. Whichever Remans were left behind were not in for a happy future. In the early 2380s, there was enough ill will towards them that Romulan soldiers tortured several of them to death, dismembering them and tossing their bodies into a waste bag. Malok, one of the Romulans tasked with cleaning the room, wryly comments that Remans leave the biggest messes for them to clean up. Though hardly a noble ending for a Reman soldier, perhaps they could take slight solace in the fact that Malok and Sub-Commander Vrek both had to deal with stains on their uniforms from the pieces of Reman that were left behind. By now we've covered most of the most messed up deaths in Star Trek on the small screen. It's time to scale up, to double up to the big. The difference is in aspect ratio and in number of entries on the list. Were it not for the movies and the fan phenomenon, Star Trek, in live action anyway, would have died a death in 1969. Just another TV show a decade later, however, the motion picture resuscitated the franchise, but was deathly slow and slaughtered by critics. Enough of a box office success, Trek's first theatrical outing didn't kill the franchise for a second. 46 years on, the film count now stands at 14, with a significantly higher mortality rate, from main characters and major miscreants to minor roles and random redshirts. As we've seen in our TV lists, a smaller budget has never been an excuse for a lack of lethal imagination. A larger one is hardly a guarantee of murderous creativity. Combine money with a delightfully twisted mind, however, and you get some of the grisliest demises in all of Star Trek. Even the least loved of the movies contain some of the worst ways to go. For this list, there will be one death from each of the 14 films, with carry the 1, multiply the intermix ratio, and add the number of 6 to spare! Death also becomes the messenger, so aim well. I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are the 20 most messed up deaths from the Star Trek movies. Number 20, Captain Randolph? Let's start on something more positive, if only to slowly shatter your illusions. Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home ranks highly in fan estimations, in good part because of its apparent lack of death. Director Leonard Nimoy had decided early on that The Voyage Home would be a different kind of movie. Quoted in The Art of Star Trek, he said, "There would be no dying, no fist fighting, no shooting, no photon torpedoes, no phaser blasts, no stereotypical bad guy. I wanted people to have a really great time watching this film, to lose themselves and to enjoy it." Vijay Amritraj, the actor and telestar who played Captain Joel Randolph of the Yorktown in The Voyage Home, wasn't quite on the same page. However, speaking to the Indian Express in 2013, Amritraj noted, "I did Star Trek IV, they killed me in that one." Things were certainly looking bleak for the Yorktown after contact with the whale probe. In a brief message to Starfleet headquarters, Captain Randolph reported that his ship had been without power for 3 hours, that non-essential crew had been given hyper sedatives to reduce consumption of life support reserves. The chief engineer was then attempting to rig a makeshift solar sail as a last-ditch effort for survival.
The truth is, we don't know the ultimate fate of the Yorktown. According to the Star Trek Encyclopedia, Gene Roddenberry suggested that a ship called Yorktown had gone on to become the Enterprise A. Either way, that says nothing about Randolph and the crew. Already in the shooting script for Star Trek IV, dated the 11th of March 1986, was something much worse. Reporting in from the USS Shepherd was Communications Officer Trillia, also seen but not heard on screen. All attempts to reinstate main power have failed. Captain Clampett has quarantined all but minimal support crew due to the failure of biosterilization capsules containing vegan D virus, which has already killed 15 crew members. Not just the one with the whales then. Number 19. God. God is dead, literally. Nietzsche would have a field day beyond the Great Barrier. Don't blame us for any blasphemy. Send your complaints to 1989 or go do some mountaineering or something. In the meantime, let's all head on down to Shakari. Sean Connery. Shangri-La? Asking the big questions is never the issue. Finding the answers is. Sybok was most definitely not the Messiah, though quite the disappointment by comparison. His visions of God and the Garden of Eden turned out to be the devil and a desolate rock, probably not far from a supermassive black hole. Realizing his error, the half-brother stepped in, only to be finished off by a photon torpedo. Or was he? When it came to the death of the dodgy deity at the galactic core, it was, of course, the Klingons who delivered the final blow. They had slain their otherwise real gods millennia ago. More trouble than they were worth, as Worf put it in Homefront. We're also assuming Shaka, last place in the unholy lookalike contest, died as well. In place of faster-than-light transportation, God might equally have asked for much better box office receipts. No one needs a starship if you kill off a franchise. With a more than poor performance in theatres, Star Trek V very nearly did just that. The most messed up thing would have been missing out on the undiscovered country. Divine intervention? No, merely the Paramount higher-ups giving it another life. Number 18. Mining Praxis. Hold on to that teacup, there's a storm brewing! The subspace shockwave felt around the galaxy, and especially on the Excelsior. Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country was an allegory for the end of the Cold War. The destruction of the Klingon moon was the Chernobyl disaster that precipitated the collapse of the Soviet Union. Praxis, as name, is then, by definition, practice over theory, and a term key to the philosophy of Marx. I cannot confirm the existence of meant the end of a certain way of doing things, and marked the beginning of another. In the analogy, Gorkin was also Gorbachev, whose Soviet reforms of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, produced a seismic shift in real-world international relations in the mid-1980s onwards. There was one major difference between the pair: a successful assassination. We'll get to that later. In the film, the Klingons had little choice but to sit down at the dinner and eventually negotiating table. No doubt the most messed up thing is that the end of Star Trek's Cold War had to be so boiling hot. Perhaps it's our fault as moviegoers, nay as humans, that we need explosions and plenty of death to precede diplomacy. According to an unused line in the script, Praxis was barren of indigenous life forms. Nonetheless, the moon's decimation still meant the deadly pollution of Kronos' ozone, and who knows what else. The number of victims was never given, and may never be known. Number 17. The Franklin Files. To find its main antagonist, the third Kelvin film dipped into the 22nd century, when history was one of the same. Balthazar Edison was Mako, then captain of the USS Franklin, Earth's first Warp 4 vessel. Vanished along with ship and crew in 2164, Edison reappeared about a century later, unrecognizable as Krall. Death and destruction preceded the paperwork of Case Closed in Star Trek Beyond. 3 was equally unlucky for a certain starship, whatever the universe. Above planet Altamede, an army of Krall's swarm drones sliced through the Enterprise like it was molecularly synthesized butter. Countless crew members were blown into space or mown down by fancy energy weapons. That fate was almost a blessing compared to what their kidnapped colleagues got. In Dr. McCoy's words, "My God, what the hell?" Edison and co. had survived the years in fighting form by using an ancient energy transference technology. In other words, they'd sucked the life out of others to extend their own. On the surface of Altamede, we got a harrowing look at the technology in action. Strung upside down, wreathing in fear and agony, 2 Enterprise officers were fed upon by Addison/Krall in front of the horrified Sulu and Uhura. Number 16. Parasite is next of kin to Chaos Goblin. The 14th Star Trek film did things differently. A first for direct-to-streaming, its title might nearly have counted as false advertising. Star Trek Philippa Georgiou would have been more accurate. Section 31, the organization, was an addendum. In Section 31, the movie, the deaths still added up. Most of the worst were in the opening scenes. What's a little parasite contest between friends? What San lacked in follow-through, the young Philippa made up for in needing a clean pair of boots. As the pot bubbled, her brother and parents began to retch. "I'm sorry," said Philippa. Little late for that, post-poison. They all died in agony as Giorgio, sister, daughter, watched immune. Hail the Emperor, bring a bucket for the blood. Mass murder's forgiven, of course, so long as you're badass at it. That would be the most messed up thing if the rest weren't Chaos Goblins. Speaking of, there was the Nanokins somewhere in the room and up in Zeph's mech tech. The latter didn't stand a chance with Fuzz the Feckless in control of his suit. Forced to drill a hole in your own skull is one way to go. Blissful relief from having to hear the names of all those hatchlings. Number 15, and all of Vulcan too. Only by absence of the USS Kelvin is it called the Kelvin Timeline. In Star Trek 2009, Captain Richard Robot was brutally murdered by the vengeful Nero. First Officer George Kirk, father of, sacrificed himself on a collision course. Absence on a much larger scale would also come to distinguish Kelvin from Prime. Absence of one was just as painful for Spock. After a bit of a break on Ruapenthe, if you watch the deleted scenes, Nero made his way to Vulcan to do a spot of mining, right down to the planet's core. Red was the matter of the black hole MacGuffin, but not before Chief Engineer Olsen was red-shirted off the side of the drilling platform. Spurious science aside, a singularity at its centre meant Vulcan was singularly screwed. In fact, the entire planet and its 6 billion inhabitants had only a matter of minutes. Spock's bid to save the Vulcan High Council and his parents in the interim was not entirely in vain, but for a few falling rocks. A couple of council members were crushed beneath once tall statues. Amanda Grayson then plummeted to her death mid-beam out as her son watched helplessly on. With only about 10,000 left of these 6 billion, Kelvin Spock was, in his words, now a member of an endangered species. Number 14, Migraine from Marcus. Blood runs thicker than water, so do brains. That is, if Alexander Marcus had any to begin with. Badmiral, and a bad dad, he was more than a headache for daughter Dr. Carol Marcus over in Kelvin. No Genesis in Star Trek Into Darkness, but still a lot of skull-crushing Khan. Well, you know what they say, if you want peace, unfreeze one of history's most notorious villains and force him to work for you on the militarization of Starfleet, including the creation of the massive Dreadnought-class ship called what else? The USS Vengeance. Because war with the Klingons is inevitable anyway. That's a loose translation from the Latin, of course. Naturally, the plan didn't last long. Even under an alias, and looking a lot like Doctor Strange without the goatee, Kelvin Khan was every bit as devious as his prime counterpart. He absconded, blew up a small chunk of London, killed Admiral Pike, and long story short, eventually caught up with Admiral Marcus for a bout of comeuppance. Though the camera cut away for the most stomach-churning moment of her dad's quasi-decapitation, Carol's blood-curdling scream was all we needed to comprehend the horror. Carol had been quite rightly ashamed before being probably very, very sick. Number 13, Spike Me Down. Star Trek Nemesis was Star Trek's nemesis, or so the legend goes. Franchise fatigue had kicked in, though it would take more than 2 years for almost 40 years and Star Trek Enterprise to be put to bed. Sounding the death knell was a burden Nemesis hardly deserved. The real villain of the piece was Shinzon. His downfall was down a spike. Technically already dead before his actual demise, Shinzon had failed to get the blood he needed from his doppelganger. He went all out for blood against the Federation instead. His ship, the Scimitar, was by definition and design the weapon. The blade stopped in its tracks by the blunt force of the incoming Enterprise E. Taking a run-up at his older alternate, Shinzon met the end, his end, of that rather pointy bit of metal. For all intents and purposes, Picard then had to witness his own youth edge its way up to die, though not before trying to strangle him. In Shinzon, Jean-Luc had killed that part of himself which no longer stared back in the mirror, but in photos from the Academy. It's little wonder the captain stood motionless in the aftermath. Freud wouldn't have touched that one with a barge pole, let alone a spike. Of course, Data then died to prove he was the most alive. Number 12, Stone-Faced Politicians. Well, that intro was all very dramatic, wasn't it? Shall we calm down and vote on all those trade negotiations on Celes 2? Senator Talora can't stay, however. She has a meeting with a Tholian ambassador. Perfectly normal quick exit, never to be mentioned again. Exit also the galaxy's worst Penn and Teller tribute act. If only politics were that simple. The Romulan version makes the Federation look like a high school debating society. Talora had also left a little trinket behind. The revenge of Remus, of Shinzon, or the echo over the voice, began by military putsch in the gruesome assassination of the Senate. A little Thalaron radiation goes a long, long way. That's Roman mythology, but it's all Greek to me. The mechanics of consumption of organic material at the subatomic level were about as comprehensible as they needed to be. The result of staring at the technological gorgon on the table was still being turned to stone. Petrification was truly petrifying as the Romulan senators took their last gasps in a shower of eerily beautiful green. Shinzon, the floor is yours, though you might want a dustpan and a brush. Number 11, fatal facelift. It's one more bad roll for the bingo card. The only prize is more free stuff from the replicator. Ranking 9th on our list of the 10 worst admirals in Star Trek, Insurrection's Admiral Dougherty was hardly the baddest of the bad. Whatever his relatively redeeming features, however, Dougherty had made his bed with the Son'a for a metaphasic miracle cure. He'd have to lie in it. Forever. Dougherty's out was one hell of a way to go. The Admiral didn't mind a bit of forced displacement, but he drew the line at mass murder of the Baku. Ruafo begged to differ with a punch to the face and a throw over the balustrade. Things got quickly more messed up from there. Ruafo rammed Dougherty headfirst into a glass-fronted cabinet, hoisted him into the air, and thrust him down onto one of those ghoulish cosmetic surgery chairs. The squeamish among us, the writer of this article among them, could close their eyes at what happened next. Dougherty definitely couldn't, nor ever again. Trapped between the pincers, the Admiral had more than just 20 years taken off. His whole face was stretched to breaking point. And to think those latter-day hippies could have just shared in the first place. But then, who wants to live forever if it's just hacky sack and bird watching? Number 10. Fake bullets, real impact. This was Ensign Lynch, pronounced Captain Picard coldly in Star Trek First Contact. Emphasis on was. Twice over, Lynch was the undead of the Borg before he was dead in Dixon Hill. Though understandable, depersonalization was the easy option for Picard. He'd returned from the depths of assimilation with the help of his crew. The lower decks weren't worthy of the same efforts now. Tough luck, huh? Picard had noted earlier in the armory that firing on assimilated Enterprise crew members would be doing them a favour. He took his own advice to the holographic nth degree, creating a Tommy gun trap for Lynch and another Borg drone, safeties off of course. He all but emptied the magazine on his former ensign. Captain Ahab would have piled it on further with the butt of his gun were it not for Lillian Satins. I think you got him! Picard still went hunting in guts for that neuroprocessor. In his own trauma, the captain had become all too comfortable with mercy and merciless killings. That famous line needed to be drawn much closer. Number 9. Taking a leak. Oh, the perennial toilet question. Don't you people in the 24th century ever pee? In Star Trek First Contact, Zefram Cochrane's pressing need was practically prescient. Later, taking a leak of the plasma coolant kind would mean death by dissolution for the Borg Queen and Data's sexy time skin. Resistance is futile has never been said with such vehemence. Tank ruptured, coolant began to flood engineering. Talk about a toxic work environment. No danger money in the different economics of the 24th century for the officers who usually worked there was at least a good way to take out the mini collective that had set up shop behind the Red Door. The Borg Queen could only hang on to Locutus in a last-ditch bid for survival. The android she'd picked, and picked apart as a replacement, soon rose up, de-skinned, like the ultra-modern Prometheus, to grab her. In the yellow-green suit below, the Queen's flesh melted away, visceral without the viscera. Her down-through-the-bone-chilling screams were matched by her drones in the throes of a second death on the upper level. All that remained of those directly exposed to the coolant was a smouldering cybernetic husk. Snap of the chrome spinal cord, Her Majesty was no more until next time. And the next time. And the next time. Number 8. Time's not the only fire. 2 of the most messed up deaths in Star Trek Generations occurred off-screen and light years away. Captain Picard's news on the holodeck was that brother Robert and nephew René had burned to death in a fire at the family home. Marie Picard survived, presumably off using the neighbour's replicator. In early drafts of the movie, writers had planned for Robert, and only Robert, to die of a heart attack out in the vineyard. According to the Star Trek The Next Generation companion, it was in fact Patrick Stewart who suggested the fiery exit, and that little René should go up in flames too. You know, more emotional impact. He certainly had a good cry. In 10 Forward, somehow, Soren's piece of poetry was just rubbing it in. His own plan to get back to paradise involved fire in the form of the Nexus, and death in the guise of the shockwave from an imploding star, or several. Heaven's not a half-pipe, it's a half-baked idea. Everyone, except Captain Picard and Soren, died on Viridian 3, as did 230 million on the pre-warp Viridian 4. Then again, no one died, except Soren and Captain Kirk. Temporal mechanics be damned in the blaze below. Number 7. Zero G is freaky. What a piece of work is a man, said Shakespeare's Danish prince and Jean-Luc Picard. In this case, it was 2 men in gravity boots and a cabal of co-conspirators. With Hamlet in the title, the death was to be expected in the undiscovered country.
Tag ba, tag be was the original Klingon question, already answered for Gorkin. Zero-G is fun until someone gets phasered. Post-prandial target practice was on the menu as the double assassins, Burke and Samno, beamed aboard the now weightless Kronos 1. Having made rather a mess of the transporter room, they proceeded to paint the corridor purple like a pair of 23rd century Jackson Pollocks. Forget Shakespeare, the hitmen then came not so gently zapping, tapping at Gorkin's chamber door. For the guard outside, the special effects cost just the arm in what was one of the most gruesome scenes in the movie. Credited as General Stex, he at least survived to be cross-examined by Grandad Worf. The same evidently could not be said about the Chancellor. Backflips are also fun, but not with a hole in the chest. Gravity restored, what went up had to come down, bodies and a lot of blood. Number 6. Peter Preston picked a pickle. Peter Preston might have merely been a young midshipman, first class, still an academy student on a training cruise, but his heroism was a match for all the officers above him. Like another a little later, he gave his life in engineering saving others. He stayed at his post. Unlike Spock, however, Preston didn't get a do-over down on the Genesis planet. Unlike Spock, Preston, badly burned and approaching death, was first carried up to the bridge by his uncle. The horrifying sight in the turbolift gave pause for more than one to gasp in horror. With no mention of the family connection in the theatrical release of The Wrath of Khan, the turbolift scene was also undeniably bizarre. We could certainly understand Scotty's heartfelt dedication to anyone in engineering, but why so heartbroken over Preston in particular? In the director's cut, Scotty's "my sister's youngest admiral" during Kirk's engine room tour answered that question. Preston's final moments in sickbay were also slightly altered. With added poignancy, the director's cut switches back to a shot of the midshipman's face as he gives his last word: I. Number 5. David and Daktag. Kill one of them. I don't care which, was the order from orbit. As with his gunner, as with that big worm, Commander Krug was comfortably casual in his brutality. On the Genesis planet, one of them was the odds of 1 in 3. Well, this wasn't the search for David or the search for Saavik, so let's call it 50-50. As it was, the blade was meant for Saavik, but David bravely leapt at the Klingon Goliath, in this case with little to no chance of winning. "You Klingon bastard, you've killed my son" becomes then the unwritten subtitle of this entry, and almost that of Star Trek III itself. Like Kirk, we, the viewer, had barely come to know Dr. David Marcus before his death at the end of the Daktag. A father's anguish at a future without was palpable through the screen. Later, in The Undiscovered Country, Kirk has a photo of David in his quarters. That was as much a touching tribute to a son as it was to actor Merritt Buttrick. Buttrick had sadly passed away in 1989, just 29 years old, from toxoplasmosis complicated by AIDS. Buttrick has 2 panels dedicated to him in the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. Number 4. Death of a Starship. It is the strangest thing to lament the loss of an inanimate object, especially an imaginary one, but then whatever has strange been a hindrance to humans and other aliens. To steal a phrase from another property, the Enterprise won't bring much cash, maybe latinum, but its sentimental value is through the roof. Whether it was alive or not to die in the first place, the starship's end in Star Trek III left no one indifferent, even if it was in the trailer. The final voyage of the Enterprise was by fireball across the skies of Genesis. Kirk had turned death into a fighting chance to live. After all, there weren't just plenty more letters, there was an entire alphabet. Don't cry because they blew it up. Smile because they could always build a new one. Few, if any, tears were shed for the Klingon boarding party with a one-way ticket to Grethor. Caught in the final countdown of the self-destruct, at least they got the same sage advice from their commander. 5 seconds was more than enough to "Get out! Get out of there! Get out!" Oh, Krug, you messed up bastard. I hope you like lava. Number 3. I can't get you out of my head. Earworms are annoying, though rarely anything to worry about. Ear eels, on the other hand, tend to stick around for longer than an overly catchy tune. Marching to the beat of his own very loud drum was the titular wrathful Star Trek II, determined to insert things, and himself, back into the galaxy. This wasn't SETI Alpha 6, it was a messed up ENT clinic, liable for more than malpractice. High up on the list of worse things than death is having one of Khan's collection of little buggers crawling down your auditory canal. That fate was reserved for both Chekhov and Tyrrell, though only one of them died from it. At the time, the commander surely wished he had. Tormented and tortured, trapped in a cupboard, then ordered to kill Kirk, Captain Tyrrell turned his phaser on himself instead, though not before vaporizing one of the Genesis scientists. We'll get to him and his colleagues in the next entry. Tyrrell self-dispatched, and the city eel inside Chekhov made a quick exit in more ways than one. Number 2. Lab rats.
In the beginning, mankind created genetically engineered uber criminals and saw that it was bad. Genesis was creation, even if it didn't quite work. Khan was destruction and the fall. In the lab, the bodies came tumbling down. All creatures great and small, there was an actual rat wandering the corridors of Space Station Regular 1 when Kirk, McCoy and Savick beamed over. It was the lucky one. After the rodent, the real jump scare, McCoy turned round to come face to dangling bloodied hands with one of the Regular 1 personnel, strung up to the ceiling, throat slit. That was the galley chief or cook, according to the script. 4 of his colleagues were then laid out in a row next to him, each having suffered the same diabolical death at the hands of Khan, who went wild on a murderous rampage for information. Of the named victims in the macabre line were scientists Madison and March, given as such in the end credits. Already cast out of Eden, just outside of the Genesis cave below, Jeddah was the name of the scientist, now a cloud, mentioned and murdered in the previous entry. Number 1. Scream in the Beam. Scotty's wee problem wouldn't have been such an understatement had it remained a plot convenience for an overlong travel pod ride. Overlong. Instead, the engineer, usually more adept at hyperbole, wins euphemism of the century for what came next with the Enterprise transporters in Star Trek The Motion Picture. They say you can still hear the screams as you cycle through the pattern buffer. The newest Vulcan, Commander Sonak, had only been in it a minute, his colleague, unnamed female officer, even less before the whole horrific spectacle. Oh no, they're forming. Screams. Enterprise, what we got back didn't live long. Fortunately. Diftor Heshmuzma. Yeah, right. To add insult to injury, no sooner had Admiral Kirk exited the transporter room than he was already talking replacements. I'd still like a Vulcan there if possible. Sonak was no substitute for Spock. If you thought the terrifying vision in the beam as depicted was bad enough, the novelization of the motion picture added the following nauseating description. Shapes were materializing on the platform again, but frighteningly misshapen, wreathing masses of chaotic flesh with skeletal shapes and pumping organs on the outsides of the bodies. A twisted, claw-like hand tore at the air, a scream came from a bleeding mouth, and then they were gone. We'd say don't have nightmares, but in this case, you're probably gonna.
Ignore that.
Yeah, TrekCulture's been going for 5 years now. We had our anniversary back in February.
So, what is TrekCulture?
TrekCulture is a place for reviews.
It's a way to talk to other Star Trek fans about what we love.
It's a YouTube channel about Star Trek.
Analysis, healthy and friendly debates and discussions.
And then there's episodes like this.
It's a place where I'm constantly having to justify why JC should have been canon.
Well, if you read the comments people leave us, TrekCulture is why Paramount pay me the big bucks. Don't tell Sean.